The great city of Hong Kong, one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Also, the city with the most skyscrapers. And yet, this obvious modern construction has a very interesting origin behind it. Today, we're going to explore the fact that Hong Kong is not nearly as old as we might realize, that it might have a very different history as we explore the concept of the Reset Saga of 1850. Hong Kong is currently considered a special administrative region of China. China, a nation with an official history that's far older than most, and you have to go back thousands of years in the past, from the official historical perspective, to find a time when China's history was myth, unlike, for example, Rome, where you don't have to go back nearly as far. Looking at these early paintings of Hong Kong, the history tells us that while it was populated, how much was actually built there. And the more recent interesting history of Hong Kong, going back and forth between the control of China and the Chinese dynasties to the British Empire, and then by the treaty, subsequently in July of 1997, reverting to control of China. Quite a considerable and dramatic event of the 20th century. Hong Kong was originally just an area of land with some hills and a wonderful natural port that fortuitously happened to be selected by British and European traders for their use in the original opium trade. And yet there's a lot of consistencies, a lot of overlapping that we find with Hong Kong that it shares with some of the other port cities that we've looked at in our explorations, such as San Francisco. There's even a terminology for how Hong Kong started and why it's ascended to its current place of, well, being one of the most premier cities of the land to this very day. And regardless of which nation controls it, whether it's China or the former British Empire, or Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, or whatever terms were going on with it, it's intriguing to me that Hong Kong seems to originate in the 1840s with the establishment as a port city. After, as part of treaty in the Opium Wars, it was established as a colony of the British Empire, after the Qing dynasty lost the First Opium War. So the official history says. But it's interesting looking at how Hong Kong was documented. We see a lot of similarities with the same way that the United States seemed to document the Native Americans. Even though they'd been in contact with these particular groups of people for hundreds of years officially, it's as though they were documenting a first contact situation. We also have the interesting overlap of the same types of images, with the same types of buildings being established in Hong Kong once it was a colony of the British Empire. Now, of course, it makes perfect sense because it is the British Empire with the same architectural style, and it's the explanation for why we see all the neoclassical architecture within this great city. And here you can see the amounts of land that were eventually taken by the British Empire in the treaties after the numerous opium conflicts. And quite interesting how we've traced the opium conflicts as yet another overlap for the series of conflicts, global conflicts that occurred 1850 to 1870. Now, the 1800s is a very problematic time frame because we have to ask the question, did those years actually happen in particular locations as we understand, or was it something completely different? You'll see some very stunning architecture here in the city of Hong Kong that was rapidly established, such as this pediment and these columns. These signs of very detailed architecture that we've seen in numerous locations all over the land. It doesn't matter which continent we're on, we'll see these exact same forms of architecture. We even have the exact same accounts with many of these structures. For example, this very elaborate and beautiful fountain, officially a product of the 1800s, and then of course demolished at some point in the 1900s. Numerous conflicts that occurred. Hong Kong was under Japanese occupation during World War II, and the city endured a series of natural disasters. Does any of this sound familiar? Looking at some of these images, though, again, you see many of the same signs that we've seen in other cities, especially looking at the so-called Old West in the United States. Only here it's a little bit more obvious. We have very intricate architecture with what looks to be some very, we'll just say, hasty signs that are established for commercial purposes. And yet, looking at all these structures, when exactly were these built? How exactly did this British colony at the time manage to establish all these structures so quickly? Well, it's intriguing when you think of what the official status of Hong Kong is and how it may overlap with other major cities in the land. Although it's also intriguing to think that Hong Kong is still one of the greatest cities in the land to this day, especially in its status as a special administrative region of China. Now, looking at the architecture, you'll see the same signs that we've seen, and even to this day, we see that instead of using standard wood scaffolding, they use bamboo scaffolding. Yet, once again, it's another sign of scaffolding. And whether it's on a modern or an older building, is it really for renovation or construction purposes? It's just something interesting to think about. Now, the origin of Hong Kong. Yes, here we have another one of these old and elaborate post offices, much like we did everywhere else. And you won't see these elaborate and decorative post offices today. Every single city has upgraded to more modern, more brutalist, or more postmodern architectural styles. Although, let's be honest, architectural styles almost seem to be assigned after the fact. What is it, though, that makes Hong Kong so unique, and why has it endured all this time? And for many Westerners, I hate to admit it, but a lot of people that I know, their first contact with the city of Hong Kong was watching the Jean-Claude Van Damme 1980s movie Bloodsport. We'll get back to that in a bit. But here we have our modern post office, and it looks nothing as intricate and as gorgeous as the older post office. No real surprise there. But what makes Hong Kong interesting? Well, originally it was an entrepot, or that's a French word for transshipment port or trading post. And you see, official history tells us that back in the times when logistics and supply chain networks and border controls were far less advanced than they are in the present time, that these cities operated as key locations where the logistics and supply chain networks of the time were critical, or trading posts as they called them. And yet here in these images you see these elaborate and isolated structures in very severely restrictive and very slopey terrain, as though it was easy to construct these structures. Now, who actually built these structures? Was it the British? Was it the Chinese? Was it the Chinese and British working together? What exactly is the purpose behind them? Why do we get the feeling that once again we're observing some other sort of recovery or salvage effort? Now again, I'm taking the images at face value. And of course, when it just comes to images, we don't know for sure. I wasn't present, and there's no historian alive today that was present when these images were taken of the hills around Hong Kong. But it's very intriguing to try to extrapolate and understand how this all came about. If the British had taken possession of this area in the 1840s, you would think that their primary purpose would have been focused on the port facilities, especially as establishing a trading post. And of course, people will justify trading posts in the old French word that we talked about earlier as something where you had no duties or no taxes to pay. Of course, in this day and age, we'll always find a good reason to impose taxes. And if you can't impose a reasonable tax, there is always a licensing fee, a duty, a registration fee, and many other means in which you can utilize your authority to, well, provide a little bit of financial incentive on the supply chain, so to speak. But why would anybody be focused on building these elaborate structures up in the hills when they should have been focused on the port facilities? It's one of those questions that I've had, and we see the same thing in numerous cities across the land that existed as these early trading posts. And we also have these elaborate municipal buildings. The Supreme Court building in Hong Kong, showing again those signs of neoclassical architecture or Roman Greco architecture. Now, yes, you can explain it by saying it's because the British controlled the area. They brought in their great architects and their great contracting, constructing personnel, and that's how they brought all this about. And maybe that's true, or maybe it's not true. Could it be possible, though, with this historical account we have of these great trading post cities, or these shipment cities, or whatever term we want to call them, that perhaps they served a very different purpose? That instead they were designated as certain areas to survive the reset event. And therefore, this is where all the supplies, all the means, if you will, to survive the reset event, and then to start a resettlement, if you will. A resettlement after the reset and a reestablishment of population, under perhaps a new authority or even some surviving authority from the previous civilization. It's hard to say. Now, of course, many would deride this as mere speculation, but yet it is very, very difficult to reconcile the official historical account in detail in terms of what actually happened. And if you ever go walking around Hong Kong, you will still see some of the classical buildings that are still used today. And it's no different than what we encounter in cities anywhere else across the land, whether it's North America, South America, Europe, Africa. It's all the same story. This architecture that just seems to be present and seems to defy what we would expect as the normal convention for a particular area. And also the images that we have that appear to show some sort of effort to change the terrain, or perhaps they were doing something else. Perhaps it was that they were removing dust, dirt, and debris from particular buildings and pushing them back into service. Perhaps there was a great salvage effort. And in certain other cities, we've seen this explained as being an effort to regrade the terrain. Although it's interesting to note that in Hong Kong, there have been no official efforts to regrade the terrain. They just simply constructed the structures on the very, very difficult high elevations, and yet continued with the port facilities. This is author James Clavell, a British Army officer from World War II who was a prisoner of war of the Japanese and subsequent author and screenwriter. He's best known for writing the Asian saga, and he's one of the individuals who was quite a proponent of bringing about understanding officially between Asia and the West. He's most well known, though, for the novel Shogun, which he wrote in the 1970s. Although here it's funny to see this original printing of it where it says he's the author of Taipan, another work from the 1960s. On Shogun, it was a novel of Japan, but what it did was it really introduced the entire concept of Asia to the West again, in 1980, especially once it was adapted into a miniseries. I was also surprised to learn that James Clavell was a very successful screenwriter, and in fact he had written the screenplay for the original film The Fly, the one with Vincent Price. No, not the one with Jeff Goldblum from the 1980s, although that was a pretty good film too. Yes, there was a remake or reimagining that was a good film. James Clavell had been captured in World War II during the Japanese advance across the Pacific, specifically the Battle of Singapore, and spent time in this very elaborate prison near Singapore. Quite an interesting and potential old world structure. He had many horrifying experiences, as POWs did, and it's also interesting to note that British actor Donald Pleasance was a prisoner of war, although he was a prisoner of war of the Germans and not the Japanese. Many of these prisoners suffered terrifying circumstances in this prison of war camp near Singapore, and James Clavell wrote about these experiences. He also seemed to have an understanding, though, of something else that had occurred within the Asian civilization, and so he wrote the novel Taipan. The novel Taipan details the efforts of the establishment of Hong Kong and the primary trading company. Now, like Shogun, it is a fictional novel, but it's based on real historical characters. Now, Taipan, written in the mid-1960s, it was adapted into a film in the mid-1980s, starring Australian actor Brian Brown as the Scottish hero Dirk Strawn. Dirk Strawn being an equivalent of a historical figure who established the great trading port of Hong Kong, and was considered the Taipan, which is a Chinese term for the head of a corporation, a foreign head of a corporation. And Dirk Strawn, the Scottish individual, portrayed by Brian Brown, who does a pretty decent Scottish accent in the film, provided you're not from Scotland, and it details his efforts and his personal revenge story, first in establishing a trading company that becomes known as the Noble House, one of the most important trading companies. What's intriguing about this film, though, is it really gives you an idea of how Hong Kong started as nothing. It's really just open terrain and just a few structures, and in a few short years, the British and the Chinese quickly transform it into a bustling city. And it's actually shown a little bit in this film. And it even has lavish production values, although it's not exactly the best of films, because when you try to translate an epic novel like Taipan into a 2-hour film, well, it's going to be very difficult. They also struggled with the fact that they were shooting in China in the 1980s, and we still had that whole East-West communism, capitalism thing going on before the Cold War officially ended. But however you want to say about the film, it's intriguing to think that, oh, yes, in the film we don't see any of the really, really tall top hats. I wonder why. Imagine if they were to remake this film today, and instead of getting some Australian guy to play a Scottish character, they would probably get Glenn Powell, because, it seems to be Glenn Powell's career is, he just does remakes. I mean, The Running Man, What else can he do? I think he could also star in 2049, After the Fall of New York. Why actually get a successful Scottish actor to play a Scottish character? That doesn't make any sense. James Clavell also wrote Noble House, which was the epic continuing the company founded of Strawn and Sons that was being run by its distant successor, portrayed by Pierce Brosnan. The miniseries was a little bit better. It also featured Deborah Raffin, fresh off of Death Wish 3, and also starred this guy. It's alright, James Clavell didn't know who he was either. Unfortunately, the miniseries didn't do so well because the network in its infinite wisdom decided to air it during the same time as the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary, when the best thing to watch was Bonnie Blair. Back when actors and athletes didn't moonlight as political pundits, they just performed. In Shogun, though, we see the story of the initial contact between East and West. And that's an interesting theme that continues through Clavell's works. I think what he was really on about, though, was this understanding and this civilization that seemed to already be in existence. It's intriguing when you think about the scene where Pilot Major John Blackthorne explains the entire map of the known world to Lord Toranaga. And yes, of course, I prefer the 1980 miniseries with Richard Chamberlain and Toshiro Mifune. And, you know how I feel about remakes. But it really gives an idea, though, about how this clash of cultures actually occurred. Why is it this guy just doesn't really sell me on being a samurai retainer? I don't know, maybe I'm just being a little too picky, but I always prefer the original works. Speaking of, I wonder if James Clavell's novel Whirlwind will be adopted for the modern screen. I mean, you know where it's actually set, a nation that's appeared in the news most frequently, but I have a very distinct feeling that for some reason this one isn't going to reach the adaptation phase. And unfortunately, James Clavell is no longer with us. And maybe that was the other issue I had with the adaptation. Something else intriguing about Hong Kong, and we've discussed it before in live stream explorations, is the existence of the Kowloon walled city. A very, very interesting urban area, and many would consider it dystopian, where there was a very large group of people confined to a very small area. Now, there's numerous different historical explanations for how this Kowloon walled city, this massive shantytown, as some would call it, developed, this area of very, very dense population. And it should be noted that Hong Kong, the overall city outside of the Kowloon walled city, is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Ah, yes, here where you'll come across Helmer and Rollins, the ineffective CID agents that were after Frank Dukes in Bloodsport. Yes, they actually filmed Bloodsport in Kowloon, the walled city. So it's very, very interesting that a couple Jean-Claude Van Damme movies, the other one being Black Eagle, featured old world architecture. Also, fun note, the guy who played Helmer was actually the first ape seen on Planet of the Apes during the hunt. But back to the walled city of Kowloon. Is it interesting that it reflects a little bit the works of the Dos Edae experiment of author Frank Herbert? Was this perhaps some sort of experiment or effort to crowd many people together in a very small urban area? And it should be noted that the Kowloon walled city had nothing to do with China. It was already demolished long before China took administrative control of the area in July of 1997. So was this some other experiment or perhaps some other remnant of older dystopian cities that may have existed towards the end of the last civilization? We like to believe that the last civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, reflected things that were far better than our current civilization. But we also have to keep in mind that they may have slipped into their own sort of dystopian nightmare that we can't even begin to imagine. It's just they had the capacity for more technology. And a greater capacity might have resulted in greater suffering for the individual. We don't exactly know what happened. However, it is a fact that the Kowloon walled city did exist, and while some people may look at these images and say, it's fabricated images created by a computer, this city really did exist, and it is very well documented. But what was really the purpose behind it? Why is it something that even existed at all? Was it some sort of experiment gone awry? Was it just a factor of many coincidences? Or perhaps the darker side of the current systems that we operate with today? Here you can even see these full basketball courts for scale compared to the rest of the Kowloon walled city. So what was it really all about? We also have other examples of very complex and densely packed urban terrain, this particular example from Paris, and the very interesting street patterns that we have. We're oftentimes told to look to our current vertical civilization that we have today, but recall that most of our vertical structures are glass structures that we believe are taller and therefore more advanced than the older structures of the past. But I think we see many examples that structures were more advanced in the past, and that they had a more elaborate horizontal layout with patterns that we often overlook. But what are your thoughts about this? And what are your thoughts about the actual Kowloon walled city? Was this just something that had developed due to circumstance, or was there some sort of design behind it? Perhaps some other sort of experiment to see how many people could be densely populated and packed together. And yes, they referred to it as the City of Anarchy, although apparently it wasn't so bad that they couldn't film Bloodsport there. And speaking of Bloodsport, you may remember the epic ending with these facts, these statistics. Yes, this is something that you should question. Consecutive knockouts in a single tournament, 56. Well, if it's a single elimination tournament, do the math. How many competitors would there have had to have been? Or you can just watch a band perform. Well, thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be examining lost technology of the old world. And our exploration today takes us to Southeast Asia. We're going to be examining some of the stunning temples and temple complexes that we have. Isn't it interesting how we always tend to call things temples or tombs, especially when we're referring to anything outside of what we consider the so-called Western world, or when we're looking in the distant past? It's as though people in the past had nothing better to do, so they were simply going to build temples and tombs. And it's a little bit of a way of referring to the fact that many of these accounts that we have for these stunning structures seem to simply be hand-waved accounts. We don't really have a good explanation, we can't really contrive a good historical account, so we're simply going to say that it's a temple, it's a religious structure, or it's a tomb, which serves religious purposes as well, but we decided to devote a lot of time to it. And isn't it funny how that seems to be the go-to explanation for many of these stunning structures, which we certainly know we couldn't construct today. For example, here in Angkor Wat, we have a tower that could possibly be related to power generation. Or does it have other possibilities for what the original purpose of this structure really was? When we look on the ground, we see a very unique and stunning appearance of construction materials that we have no idea how long they've been there, and what was the exact process used to construct this very unique temple complex. We're going to examine these, and we're also going to try to posit some theories for what the real purpose of these buildings were beyond just simply being towers and tombs. And our first exploration takes us to Wat Arun in Bangkok, Thailand. And we can see that Bangkok is a very complex city, and it's certainly one worthy of a full city exploration, and will be coming in the following months when we move to Southeast Asia. But for right now, we're staying focused on the temple of Wat Arun, which just happens to be right off the major river running through the center of Bangkok. And we also have an exploration concerning rivers as well, because they're rather interesting. We see the main prang or tower surrounded by several smaller prangs, and getting on the ground we can see that this temple is extremely advanced in its construction. We can see that this main tower has construction techniques in it, in methods that we couldn't easily replicate today, even if we were building a small model of it. That's maybe 1/100th scale. And of course people will tell us it's because back in Thailand in the day they worked harder, they didn't have safety standards. And yes, I know we go over that many times. But even looking at the approach to the temple, we can see advanced construction techniques. And we'll be told that this is a Buddhist temple, and that it's because of the devotion to the study of Buddhism that's what facilitated the construction of this temple. That's always the explanation. And yet the main prang and some of the subsidiary architecture is very impressive, as we have many surrounding and smaller towers, which gives the impression that there was a completely different purpose behind this temple, and really this is a temple complex itself, even though they just say it's a temple. And what was its original purpose? Was it for power generation? Was it designed to contribute to the spirit of the people? Wat Arun, Temple of the Dawn, it's Buddhist. We're told it was founded in 1656, but then the main prang was built during the 19th century? Why is it everything was constructed in the 19th century? And even in Southeast Asia, we can't escape that particular narrative tone. And yes, I am going to say the word narrative because that's what it is. It's as though the entire world was built in the 19th century. Now, they don't exactly know when this original temple was built. They just say it's always sort of been there. But let us assure you that the main prang was constructed in the 19th century, because when else would it be constructed? Looking, though, at some of the details, we see something that reflects of a long gone past glory with this particular temple. We see more of a natural construction technique, and by natural, something that appears a lot more organic. There's something much more than what we'll see in our favorite architectural stylings of brutalist. No, nobody was thinking of brutalist here in the 19th century when they constructed this. And interestingly enough, this particular temple has been renovated as well, so once again it appears as though they're obfuscating the account. But you can appreciate and see the great beauty in the architectural detailing. How exactly did they do all this? Are we to believe that a veritable army of thousands descended upon this site to find, chisel, and carve out all of these impressive figures and all of these beautiful works of natural art, and that they spent years and years doing so? Or in the 19th century when they made this temple? What's interesting, though, is that, or the main prang, what's interesting, though, is that the subsidiary temples, or the subsidiary prangs and towers, have the exact same appearance to them as the main tower. So stepping outside the box here, and stepping outside what our given historical account is, I'm speculating on what the real purpose of this temple really was. And we see something that could have been anything from power generation to perhaps a gathering place to restore the spiritual health of the people at the time. I think there's a reason why many of these surviving structures from the old world tend to be labeled as religious structures, because they do seem to have a little bit of a religious or a spiritual effect to them. But if we go back to what their original intended purpose was, if they were designed to reinvigorate the spirit within the individual, because we speculate that in the past civilization there was a balance between the individual and the society that they lived in, then the real function of religion and spirituality in that society was to also reinvigorate the individual. Now, we're told that continues to this day in our major religions, and yes, you can still find that. But I'm not wondering if that's a nice little parallel that happens to continue with all these structures. And I believe that when you look at the beauty of this particular prang or main tower here in Bangkok, you can see a lot of that beauty reflected within it. But could there have been other purposes, other intentions behind this very impressive structure? And really, I would just like to hear what some of your theories are on how they actually built this. And I know one of the prevailing theories is now geopolymers, but you still have to actually have the logistical capacity to move all these geopolymers and actually pour all this. So how was it really done? Was it done with some sort of advanced infrastructure system, which it had to have been done, advanced roads, advanced travel systems, or was it done with some sort of aerial delivery system, some sort of advanced airships that we've speculated on? We'll see what appears to be the added Buddhist elements of this temple, and it does reflect of the great spirituality that accompanies Buddhism. And indeed, all the major religions of the world reflect great spirituality in their baseline statements, and yet all of them have the same institutions that accompany them. So it's quite a fascinating dichotomy when you're trying to understand and explain what the religious effect of a particular religious structure is, and compare and contrast that with what the institution of the religion is telling you about it. It's also fascinating when you think about the fact that our religions are supposed to be about focus on spirituality and an internal focus, and yet we seem to have such a devotion to an external focus. And really what I'm doing is I'm just examining the mainstream account there, because we're told one thing, but then we're showed something different, and then we do something that's different from what we're told and what we're shown. And that's something we have to question, because I believe there is a lot of validity in our major religions, and I believe that the basic tenets of them are something that reflect the older world, the concept of achieving a real balance between the individual. And for whatever reason, in many of the tenets of Far Eastern philosophy, it seems as though the older world seems to have survived intact. And it's not something that's mingled or muddled by the whole concept of words. And you can certainly look in the book 1984 to see how language can be altered, even speaking the exact same language, because you can change the meanings of words. Let's just take the word sanction, for example. Sanction, a word in the English language that has two entirely opposite meanings. You sanction my videos? What do you really mean? Are you supporting my production of these videos? Or are you saying that I am not allowed to produce the videos? That's just one example. And the reason I highlight that example is because I believe we see this contradiction. This contradiction is present everywhere when you examine this structure in Bangkok, Thailand. You see a structure that is very advanced, and yet you're supposed to believe that in the 19th century, a bunch of individuals managed to carve all this out. At least that's what I think the mainstream would have us believe. But do they have some other very elaborate explanation for it? They managed to channel water from the river, and then the river slowly grounded out the structure of this impressive temple. Now, I know one of the comments I've gotten is the images that I show are not always of the finest quality. And one of the reasons that I do that is I want to show a little bit of a different impression of the images. There's also something that I question with the constant use of high-definition images. Now, I'm not saying that I suspect that high-definition images are altered, but it's intriguing to me how, when I viewed one of my favorite films in high definition, I noticed that somehow it seems to have been changed in subtle ways, as opposed to looking at the original film in its original definition. Now, it's almost as though we're being conditioned to want to see things in a particular way. Now, my personal preference would be to actually get on the ground and really do an on-site exploration of this impressive temple in Thailand. Yet, we can still get the idea, and I'm simply trying to encourage the idea that we need to do our own explorations. We need to do our own research, and every individual should follow up as they feel fit on trying to explain what the original origin of this impressive temple in Bangkok really was. And that was actually how I facilitated my classes back when I did teach. And of course, I drew a great deal of criticism and derisive comments from some of my colleagues because they thought I should just be doing lectures all the time, and if I bored my students out of their mind, then they would retain it. And it's always interesting how none of them had any interest in talking about history or wanting to think about it after time. But isn't it funny how many people now suddenly seem to be coming out of the woodwork and challenging alternative explanations for what they believe are well-documented historical events? There certainly has to be a reason behind that. What exactly do the figures represent here in the tower? Are the figures some sort of advanced human beings of the past? Do they represent some sort of spiritual originality that we had? Or are they simply reflections of a long past time? One of the things that's crossing my mind when I look at this temple is this really a temple from the 4th era? Or could this actually be a surviving structure from the 3rd era? It is entirely possible that there were some structures that may have survived the reset from the 3rd to the 4th era. And perhaps this reflects one of them, and that's how we can explain what appears to be great age in this main prang or tower. We're told by the mainstream that they had to do renovations in the 2010s on this main tower. Now, why are we always doing renovations? Again, we have some of the same story beats with all of these wonderful edifices, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, Russia, or down here in Thailand, that these structures are eroding over time because they were poorly constructed. And I find it very hard to believe that this main tower was actually built in the 19th century. But perhaps it was built in a period of time that we're simply told was the 19th century, and it's far older. Could there also be some more radical explanations for what this structure originally was? Was this some sort of incredible power generation structure? Look at these interesting figures here by this building. And of course you have the pointy tower. And what exactly do these figures represent? Okay, look, I'm going to go there. I'm just going to say that these remind me of the guards from the movie Big Trouble in Little China. Even though this doesn't have anything to do with China, there's no doubt that this very unique aesthetic influenced that film. Now, could John Carpenter have been trying to communicate something to us by telling us about that film and those figures? Certainly. This is one of the oldest images that we have of this particular temple. And I find it interesting that this is from the 19th century, and of course they're not going to show you the main praying. Not because I'm suggesting that it was already there, I'm just saying that they coincidentally don't show it in any of the old photos. And don't even ask me about construction photos, because I have a feeling that there are none to be found. I couldn't find any in my initial attempts, but maybe you can find some and let me know and share them. It'd be interesting to see what kind of construction photos they have of a structure such as this. Just hang up the tarps and you'll be shielded from the wind as you are very carefully carving all these intricate detailed figures. Now, the Buddha statues here are interesting because they do appear to have been added later, but were they? Or was there some other explanation? And of course we have advanced columns with decoration towards the top. So you can see that it wasn't just the Romans who did the advanced columns. What else is advanced though in this tower is also seeing how it's layered and detailed. Now, someone will try to tell us that, yes, this matches the great Gothic carvings that they did in Europe when they built all those cathedrals over the last 1,000 years. But does it really? And then there's always the explanation of, well, these are different cultures across different lands. But one of the things we suspect with the Fourth Era is that all these cultures were present. It's just that they managed to live together in harmony and achieve a joint civilization. So it is possible that this structure could have come from the Fourth Era. But for some reason, I'm suspecting that it came from the Third Era, and that all the attempts at renovation to make it look newer are to try to reflect that. Here, even on this image, you can see in this little, we'll just call it a banister, all the detail that's carved on it. And you can see it behind these individuals as well in this photo. Very impressive. Well, let's consider Mount Meru, and one thing I didn't mention about the temple we just looked at, and the temple we're going to look at, is that the central towers reflect Mount Meru. What's the explanation behind Mount Meru? Well, it's a cosmological explanation that comes from Buddhism, that Mount Meru represents the main mountain that all life on the lands came from. And it's a very interesting consideration because we think about how life may have evolved on the land, and is this a more accurate story of our origin? We're not exactly certain, but it is intriguing to me how Mount Meru may well be reflected on those old maps that we look at, especially when we look at a certain polar region that we're not supposed to discuss. And there are many different depictions for the concept of Mount Meru, and it's intriguing for me to realize that Mount Meru doesn't necessarily reflect a geographically limited area. It reflects the existence of all things, that all life and all structure of the lands revolves around Mount Meru. So is it something that's really limited by a geographical definition, or is it something that manages to be both? And oftentimes these are confusing and conflicting thoughts, but given the fact that we deal with nothing but conflict from even our mainstream account, it's how we have to approach things. A lot of the artwork and a lot of the genesis of Mount Meru is very beautiful, and it's one of the baseline tenets of the origin of the lands, and I think there's a lot to be said for it. There's also the fact that many of the structures are supposedly built to reflect Mount Meru. Now, could it be possible that this is a remnant of an older philosophy? There's no doubt about it. And here, is this a representation of Discworld, for those of you that are familiar with that fictional or science fiction story, where we have the turtle and the elephants that's actually carrying the known land on it? Well, it seems to be something that's reflected in the artwork quite frequently. And perhaps within this, we can find more accurate descriptions for what the true genesis and development of the land was over the time. Well, let's go and look at our other structure, or temple complex, because we're not looking at tombs today. And we head over to Cambodia to look at Angkor Wat. And we can see very developed temple complexes here with fine geometrical patterns. Now, the mainstream tells us that Angkor Wat is the largest religious structure in the lands. But I question that, and I don't question that because I question the true beauty and utter amazing aspects of this structure, which we can see here on the ground. But the reason I question that is I don't wonder if the mainstream is trying to mislead us, because there are many things that are conflicting. Now, are they trying to intentionally mislead us, or are they just incidentally misleading us? Well, that's a question we can debate at some other time. But once again, we see a very advanced temple complex. Very unique figures here. Are these reflecting lions, jackals, or something else? Or some other creature that may have existed from a time long past? And don't worry, the mainstream has an explanation for us, and even though they say that evolution could have included every sort of creature ever imagined to have existed, they can assure us that these creatures did not exist. So don't bother trying to question it through that means. Look at some of the very advanced construction details, though, in this temple complex. And we're told that these are the architectural efforts of the 12th century from the Khmer Empire. So, once again, we have kings and we have empires in Southeast Asia, and don't expect to find anything else, especially from the past. We see very impressive pillars and columns, and yet they have a different artistic appeal to them, and yet we can see the figures. So overall, we have Angkor Wat. We're told it's in the Angkor Wat style. It's a Hindu-Buddhist temple complex, and construction took place over 28 years in the 12th century. And we know the king, and we know the religious figure who inspired the king to do it. Once again, reflecting the same pattern of stories that we have from Europe and from across the lands. So it's as though our imagination in our historical account is not that good. Or if it is accurate, it seems that human beings are a lot more alike than we like to admit. But if we're so much alike, then why are we always so fixated on killing each other, or trying to say that one group is superior to another, or one group is inferior to another, which we still do. We're tricked into doing it quite effectively every day. This temple complex is stunning to look at, and it really boils the question down: was there something from the era that this was originally constructed in where we have a true integration with nature? Because you can even see there's something much more organic with this entire temple complex. And the explanation will be, well, it's closing on 1,000 years old. So given the fact that it's down there in Southeast Asia and the environment's different, it's a jungle and there's a lot more rain, it only makes sense. But actually what I find impressive is that with the effects of that unrelenting humidity that that area is known for, all of these structures have endured so well. And look at all these figures. And what exactly does this originally represent? There seems to be some sort of aspect of humanity that we're seeing here that goes beyond the simple explanation that we have for our religious tenets. I'm not discounting them, but I can understand why someone would come across a structure like this and simply want to label it a temple or a tomb. Because how else do you really explain it? And even with all of our supposed advanced methods of construction and technology that we have now, could anybody do this? Could anybody build a temple complex like this now? And if they could, how long would it take? Those are the kind of questions we have to ask. And what is the true nature of the construction material within this temple complex? Is this a geopolymer? Is this some sort of advanced construction material that we can't even begin to imagine? Something that they were able to form in place in sectionals and then place in the actual structure and fix together in means that we can't even begin to understand. Some of these images are just truly astounding with the fact that we see an integration of nature with this artificial structure. And I find that looking at the images of this structure indicate that this is something that's far older than we've been led to believe. And yet you still see the precision and the detail in all these figures. An army of individuals that just decided to go up there and carve this during very difficult times in the 12th century. And yet these figures are of the very finest that we've seen across all the lands. The intricate detail. So while there is the explanation that this has something to do with power generation, I believe that the original origin of the structure had many more purposes than simple power generation. And we also have to remember that if this is a surviving structure from the Third Era, then what we're looking at is something that's small in terms of scale, because we believe that there were much larger structures that were destroyed by much greater forces at that time. And that which survived was that which was remote in that civilization that existed, or was not subjected to the main forces of whatever the particular reset that the Third Era faced. And perhaps that explains a lot of the scorching and degradation that you do see in this very stunning structure. Yet at the same time, so many details have endured. So much of the beauty continues to survive to this day. And this is perhaps the most alluring aspect of Southeast Asia. And it seems as though there was a very concerted attempt during the mid-20th century to, how shall we say, reduce the structures that were in Southeast Asia. Indeed, there's accounts of a conflict between the Khmer Rouge and other forces in Cambodia that led to some damage to this temple complex. Well, fortunately, they were just using small arms, and it was not subjected to more of the destructive implements that we know are at the disposal of our current civilization. It is impressive to see that a structure like this has endured for such a time, and it's very inspirational at the same time, because this is not something that I suspect that was built in the 12th century. I suspect that this is much older. But, conversely, could the timeline still be similar or the same? Yes, it could be, because we just don't know. It goes back to that whole concept of the date paradox. What's the baseline event, and how much time has actually passed? Here's what you really have to think about. You can't verify what happened firsthand prior to your own existence. It's one of the difficulties that we encounter with these explorations. So what you're left to rely on is the mainstream account that you have, or alternative accounts, which may or may not be accurate, or maybe 50% accurate, 50% altered. Unless we're simply supposed to believe, as the mainstream account would have us believe, that every single historical account was maintained in total objectivity by governments, civilizations, and cultures, yes, cultures, that at the same time they will tell us were inherently corrupt. We're told to respect and appreciate the Roman civilization, and yet at the same time we're relentlessly told about how corrupt they were, how evil they were, and how they practiced the horrifying aspects of a society that had its own decay sewn into its very origin. But I suspect that what we had in the past was something far beyond that. That we did really achieve a balance between the individual and society. And I think that in surviving structures like Angkor Wat in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia and Thailand, we see examples of that. We see examples of the very pinnacle of what humanity can be when we express ourselves and when we manage to explore ourselves on the inside and the outside. We'll be looking more at Southeast Asia. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Rescue to Orbis channel, and today we're going to be looking at Japan's castles, or castles of the land of the rising sun. The castles in Japan seem to be something that might go against the theories that we have of a pre-existing civilization, especially within the land of Japan. These castles are very intricate and ornate, and they're made primarily with wood and stone, and they have a very unique design to them. And yet, when we examine these castles, we'll find that there are particular similarities that we've seen in other castles across the lands. What's intriguing, though, is that as we look closely at these castles, we notice that there is a lot of fine stonework involved in the foundations and the steps, and of course many of the walls. And we'll be informed that, much like castles across the land, that these castles are for military purposes. These are fixed fortifications that are designed to be defended at all costs from infantry and cavalry assaults, and we're well familiar with the shogunate era of Japan and its great conflict that occurred until the Tokugawa shogunate was established after defeating the other contenders for the shogunate. And for those of you who don't know, the shogunate, or shogun, of Japan is the supreme military dictator who rules in name of the emperor. And the Tokugawa shogunate ruled from roughly the 1600s all the way through until the mid-1800s, or the 19th century. Yes, that century again. Here, as we look at Osaka Castle, though, we do see some familiar touches that we've seen in other castles, where we have a very complex and well-developed, geometrically precise foundation structure, and then another structure built on top of it. Now what's interesting is that when we look at the castles, we see that they have that wood structure to them, and yet we have all these older blocks that also go along with these castles. So what exactly is going on here? What is the real mystery behind these castles? Were these castles really from the era that we're told that they were built in? And many of them were told were built in the 1600s, some even older. Some of the oldest ones built all the way back in the 12th century. Now, there's other stories that say that they've renovated many of these castles, and after World War II, there was an effort to bring about some renovation and understanding of Japanese history, and we can certainly appreciate that. Yet, isn't it funny how it seems to match many of the other stories that we've seen across the land? And it's also no shortage of castles across the land. We expect to see castles in Europe and Germany, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and yet in our explorations we found that there are castles everywhere. Castles in the United States, New York, Minnesota, Iowa, places you wouldn't expect to come across castles. But in Japan we see that there are these elaborate wooden structures. Now, are these structures that were built potentially by the 5th era civilization or our civilization? Or is there more to them, especially when we look at the aerial imagery from above? And we can see that they have a very complex geometrical pattern, also well integrated with the terrain, and nature integrated with the artificial construction. Always the sign of a more advanced civilization, it would seem. There's also a very serene beauty with many of these lovely Japanese castles. We can see that they seem to fit well within their natural terrain quite perfectly. And yet it's the walls that seem to integrate the most, and then when you have the built-up castles that we're told are made of wood, although, to be honest with you, I haven't actually explored a Japanese castle on site. It's certainly something I would enjoy doing, and throughout my life I have studied Japan, and one of my favorite novels, I will admit, is Shogun, written by James Clavell. James Clavell, who had experiences with the Japanese during the World War II time frame, and they might not have been the most positive experiences, and yet he developed an understanding and a respect for the Japanese culture. We look and we see many of the ornate details that reflect the Japanese culture, especially within these castles. And perhaps that's why we would say that this is something from the mainstream account that seems to go against our theories of a pre-existing civilization, because it seems very clear that these castles represent Japanese culture, and they are confined to the geographical area of Japan, so it all makes sense in a lot of different ways. And yet at the same time, as we look closer, we see many of these more exact rock formations that have a geometric precision to them. And we know what these are signs of when we look at these, the signs of a more advanced civilization that's actually in the foundation eras. Now, what was really going on in Japan? Well, we have the story that there were these great wars between the daimyos, the Japanese feudal lords. They had an emperor, and yet the emperor didn't actually rule Japan from the 1600s to the mid-19th century. Japan was effectively ruled by a shogun, or military dictator, and the rule was called the shogunate. And Tokugawa Ieyasu was the individual who had finally won the wars and unified the nation. Now, interestingly enough, during that entire time frame, we have this account that there was a great time of peace. There was no conflict, and the nation was very stable, interestingly enough, despite having feudalism. Look at this kind of precision here in the rocks with these dragon figures. Very interesting and very unique, and what exactly does that tell us? What does that really show us when we think about what we have with many of these fine Japanese castles? We do see triangular shapes that we would think match pediments. There's also an incredible curvature, and yet still geometric precision within these castles, just in a different way than what we've seen in other castles in Europe. We also have the same foundation structure with the stones and the walls, and they seem to have a lot of effort that was put into them that reflects exactly all the detailing when it comes to architectural achievement, and then of course the logistics in doing this. And these castles are all over the place in Japan. You'll find them in every single civil authority area or prefecture. When you look at this kind of castle, though, you see a little bit more of an advanced styling with it, and it seems to be more integrated within its walls. And so it seems as though some of the castles are much older, and some of the castles are newer, and indeed the mainstream account does reflect that. Yet, looking at many of the castles, you can see that some, we're told, have been recently renovated or rebuilt in the 20th century, and isn't that always the story? But yet, what's original? Well, of course, it's always the foundation structure, the stones that we're admiring right now, that make up a very precise wall. Now, does that mean that these castles were originally intended to be on top of these stone structures, or did we have something else that originally reflected this? Did we have something that made a little bit more sense in terms of how the stonework was? Perhaps it was something even more advanced. Here, as we look at Osaka Castle, we can see a very complex series of walls, and Osaka Castle is one of the most famous, and indeed it's where the conflict for who was going to become shogun was finally decided, when the heir was defeated by Tokugawa Ieyasu and his family and clan. And here again, looking at this aerial imagery, we can see a bit of a geometric precision and also integration with the water into the terrain. Now, again, we know where we've seen this before with many of the great cities or the geometrically precise foundation structures, or star forts as they're called. Here, even in this imagery that's supposedly from the 19th century, we can see that Osaka Castle has always had these well-developed blocks and yet integrated castle formations on top of it. Now again, was this something that was built after or before the last reset? It seems to be a little bit confusing. In other words, were the castles added or were they not? We seem to have both indications though. And yet when we know that renovations have occurred, then it is a fact, or at least we can claim it as a fact, that many of the castles were added much later. But yet we have something else. We have a star fort, Gorukaku. And yet, this is a classic European star fort. We're told that Gorukaku was built by a Japanese engineer who was directed by the Tokugawa shogunate to study European methods. And so, of course, he went around to Europe and saw many of these great cities, and they say it, cities, and these star forts, as they call them, and decided that they were going to build their own in Japan. Now, it's intriguing because I remember studying the original base history of Japan, and as I originally understood it, the Tokugawa shogunate was not keen on opening up the isolation policy of Japan. Japan was isolated from the rest of the world, this is according to the official history, and it was only when Commodore Matthew Perry showed up with his gunboat diplomacy that opened Japanese ports to the rest of the world. And the Tokugawa shogunate, now in this history that I'm familiar with that I did not know in the 20th century, even though I studied many different lesson plans on Japan, apparently the Tokugawa shogunate did invite new technological advancements, and so they sent engineers who were able to quickly learn this process of building star forts, and they decided to build this incredible star fort. Now, when they had what was called the Meiji Restoration, that was when the Emperor of Japan reasserted his authority over the entire nation, and the Tokugawa shogunate was forced to resign. There was a war that was fought. And then there was another war that was fought, and apparently the defensive Tokugawa forces used this star fort as their final base. It was not enough to save them from defeat, though. And isn't it funny how that seems to match the many accounts that we have from the United States Civil War of the star forts not actually being effective? Very intriguing that that account matches so perfectly. This is a very pretty one here, though, and I can see why this would be fun to spend Christmas in Japan. You got to give Japan credit. They know what to do with the star fort. They decide to light it up, turn it into a beautiful park, and yes, we have some as historical monuments in the United States, the one that we talked about in St. Augustine, but there's something almost more beautiful and more alluring and intriguing when we look at this one. And of course, like many other star forts, we see it shares the same patterns. Not just the same geometric precision, but also the integration of the natural into the artificial. Now, here's another example. We go to Fort Wagner from the United States Civil War. Certainly somebody had to be aware of this, the charge of the 54th Massachusetts. Now, that's not an avenue of approach. That's not even a mobility corridor. That's a massive choke point where they tried to attack through a prepared engagement area, and it did not go well for the 54th Massachusetts. But of course, their bravery and valor did encourage other African-American soldiers to join the Union Army, and they managed to overcome the South with manpower. You'd think they would have been aware of that, but the other interesting thing is that the Meiji Imperial Restoration Forces had very advanced ships at their disposal. Now keep in mind, this is only about 15-16 years after Perry had even opened up Japan from isolation. And voila, they have steamers, and they have advanced ironclads even. And we did look at ironclads in our exploration of the United States Civil War. So very intriguing that, of course, it's the United States that has an expeditionary contact with Japan, and the official history tells us that the isolation policy ended. Now, when I talk about the original history, I'm talking about how it was the Meiji Restoration, after the emperor was restored to authority, that Japan decided to embark on learning all the wonderful ways of Europe and the United States so they could become modernized in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution in Japan, because they'd been closed off. Now we look at the sorin that top the Japanese pagodas or Buddhist shrines. And we have many different name components to the sorin, and what do these really look like to you? And you'll see in these upcoming images that there are numerous examples of these sorin on the top of Buddhist shrines, and some that are just displayed out in the open terrain. What exactly do these represent? Now, of course, we're told that this is merely a spiritual representation of Buddhism, and it's integrated into these structures, much in the same way that you see crosses integrated and built into churches. But could it be that these sorin have an entirely different purpose behind them? Are we potentially seeing the remnants of some kind of technology from a pre-existing civilization, or indeed the civilization that preceded our own? And for whatever reason, whatever transpired in Japan, while we're told it's called the Meiji Restoration, what if that was a conflict that was designed to remove an enclave of survivors from before the reset? And then we have this technology that's remaining. And indeed, when you look at this sorin, you have the feeling that this is more advanced technology. Is this some sort of energy generation device? Is this some sort of energy collection device? Or could they even have a much more advanced function? Something beyond our ability to fully imagine. When we talk about how we think on the sounds and the cymatics of all the churches across the land, generating individual and spiritual health within individuals, what if these sorin filled the same function as many of those bells? Perhaps in a different format, not relying necessarily on sound. It's always intriguing when we think about these different aspects of how technology may have worked in the pre-existing civilization. And yet we have a very clear indication across Japan with the establishment of all these sorin here on top of a pagoda. And even the pagoda itself seems like it's an advanced form of technology itself. Now, what are they constructed of? Well, everything. Stone, wood, so we're told. And could they have been constructed of those same materials in pre-existing civilization? Certainly. Looking closer, though, you can see that it has a more technological appearance to it that seems to imply an advancement beyond what we'd initially think, especially for Japan at this time. And then we look at one of the stone-formed ones, very intricate and very detailed. Now, can you really imagine someone going around there and actually carving that out? Or is that some sort of prefabricated structure that served a technological purpose? And we can see how well they're integrated in the terrain. Now, many naysayers will tell us that, yes, this is just a natural appearance for Japan. They have a very beautiful and orderly civilization and always have, and if you want to see a classic example of that, then look no further than watching the miniseries Shogun and see how the European sailors from the Erasmus, the Dutch sailors, compared to the Japanese at the time. There was really no comparison. Of course, then it begs the question, then if that was still their perception of Westerners, why in the heck would they want to adopt Western policies and civilization? But, they have a good story for it. And like I said, I do not recall learning that the Tokugawa shogunate wanted to adopt Western ways. Well, now we're told that because they wanted to adopt Western ways, that's what led to the Meiji Restoration. And then once the emperor was reinstalled as the supreme authority of Japan, he decided to follow the same policy that the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown for following. So once again, it is the conflicting account. But when you look at these images, you can see that there seems to be a greater technological component that's implied within them. And even this antenna, power harvester, power generator, what could it be? It seems to show something that's of a more advanced technology, an entirely different age than we can fully imagine. And given the ubiquitous presence of all these sorin, or whatever name we want to assign to them, and who knows what their original name was, or what the original language that was spoken, we get the concept, though, that this is something far beyond merely a representation of a religious structure. Of course, it makes sense for it to be labeled and function as a religious structure today, much in the same way that the churches, cathedrals, basilicas that we've explored across the land and other lands. And yet at the same time, while we might think that these castles and these particular structures reflect a different culture, maybe the reality is they reflect a closer baseline to the previous civilization, that we really do have some remnants here that are available in Japan. Let's not forget that it was completely fortuitous that Japan also ended up on the side of destruction in World War II. And we know that Japan was subjected to the same forces that Germany was. And of course, we'll be told that was necessary. It was a global conflict at the time. But I find it more than just a coincidence that we have the same pattern of destruction, and yet we can see in these remaining structures, much as we see in the castles of Germany, There seems to be a much deeper story that goes beyond what we're told, that this was merely the achievements of the medieval times in Japan, just as it was the achievements of the medieval times in Germany. And indeed, you'll find many analogies between Japan and Germany that historians like to highlight now. They talk about how the Teutonic Knights, the German knights, reflected the Japanese samurai, that the Teutonic Knights were really a version of German samurai as they were going about spreading German culture. Although when you really start to compare and contrast after that, it breaks down rather quickly, but that's just my opinion. Looking at this structure, though, you truly get the idea of something that's far more advanced, that has a much greater purpose than what we would truly understand. When you see the antennas on top, or the sorin, whatever you want to call them, use your eyes. What do you see? What do you think all these structures were really designed for? What do you think was the purpose of all these apparatuses that are in place on the top of them? Is it really what we're told? Or is there a much greater story behind it? Does it have a much more in-depth story than we're fully aware of? Because you look at all these pagodas, and even these pagodas are far more advanced. And by the way, you might recall on one of the very original explorations on the channel, I believe it was exploration number 2, when we looked at the Germany book, we noticed that there was a pagoda in Germany too. So I'm not sure. Now let's look at Japanese Western eclectic architecture. So apparently, as a result of this Meiji restoration and this influx of Western influences, Japan decided to adopt Western architecture, of course. Now, this happened in the 19th century. I know you're shocked as everything else happened in the 19th century. There's also these rather bizarre examples of what they call Greco-Asian sculptures. It's a really interesting amalgamation, though, of two cultures in this particular sculpture. And I'm not sure if it's truly accurate or if we're just looking at something that's a representation. But these are actual structures that are very much in Japan, and you can see that this particular structure, we wouldn't be surprised if we saw it in Germany, and after our more recent explorations, we could see something like this in Wisconsin or Iowa in the United States. And yet here it is in Japan. And then, of course, we look at one of the great first banks in Japan, and it has a very elaborate structure to it as well. And as you look towards the top of it, for some reason, I'm reminded of the Anamosa prison that we looked at in Iowa. I wonder if it's even made out of Anamosa limestone. And then we have other structures where we see the classic columns that are integrated into the bricks here, and of course, just simply utilization of bricks. But don't you find it intriguing that, once again, it is the 19th century? It's always the 19th century. In fact, they built the Star Fort in Japan in the 19th century. But are all the castles representation of Star Forts? And look at this here. We have a little lion. And why is it we see lions everywhere? Well, now we see lions in Japan too. I guess everybody admired and respected the lion, and that was just another one of those coincidences that just happened to be all across the land. So when you really look deeper, you suddenly understand that the initial impression that we're given of Japan is that it was an isolated nation, an isolated culture, and as a result of which, it's a clear form of evidence that shows us that the mainstream account is correct. And yet when we look closer, we find many aspects, such as this building we're looking at right now, with these particular towers and the layout of this architecture, that seems to completely counter what we're given in the mainstream account. Now, could the mainstream account be correct? Absolutely. But when you look at this evidence firsthand and when you explore these buildings, the likelihood of the mainstream account being correct seems to be diminished every single day with every single exploration. Once again, looking at one of these combination sculptures. What culture is this really representing? Or is this actually representing a society, a civilization from before our time that's not recorded? What makes more sense to you? And yet we have these other buildings that they seem to have modified or renovated that had a different structure, and yet they tried to reincorporate what many people would view as a Japanese structure. In the 20th century, of course, when somebody seemed to realize that they needed to make sure that there was nothing that really busted the narrative, or the mainstream account, as it were. And yet, looking at this particular structure, we've seen this exact structure with this kind of tower on it before. So what does this all really represent? What does this all really tell us? It is a slew of evidence that shows us that first impressions are not correct. That as soon as we do actual explorations, we can find houses, we can find museums, we can find banks, we can find palaces. Yes, we got a palace we're going to look at. That suddenly show us what we would consider the classical Greco-Roman style of architecture. Or, as they call it, the Japanese Western eclectic architecture, just invent a new name, such as the National Museum here. Ah, yes, we have our classic dome here, and I think I see some more lions. What are we going to see next? Griffins? I wouldn't be surprised. But you see the same spires, you see the dome structure, and you see the columns. We know what this architecture truly represents, and we certainly have our ideas behind it. And when you look on the interior, this may as well be any museum that we've been in the United States, or this could even be Union Station in Kansas City. What's really the difference? Well, the official explanation is they suddenly wanted to embrace Western architecture. Suddenly, for no real reason, Japan wanted to be like the West, Europe and the United States. And here is the Akasaka Palace, built 1899 to 1909. And this replicates many buildings that we've supposedly seen in Austria, and it even gives me some trappings of thinking back to our St. Petersburg exploration in the Winter Palace there. And we can see that this is a very well-detailed and well-constructed ornate palace that has pediments and columns and, of course, the same foundation stones. How is it that the Japanese were able to pull this off so easily in 1899 and 1909? And the answer will be, well, it was the end of the 19th century. They didn't have safety standards. They were all fanatical workers. There were no distractions of modern technology, and doing such things was very easy. Even though they had absolutely no official history of building like this, being able to learn and embrace it rather quickly, just as with the Star Fort earlier, it was a matter of simplicity and dedication. And certainly we don't mean to question the hard work ethic of the Japanese or the innate intelligence, but yet at the same time, it just doesn't make sense that they would suddenly want to embrace this, especially when you see how the Japanese view their culture. That is the conflict. That is the conflicting account. And yet, here we have this very impressive palace that would be right at home in Rome or St. Petersburg or Vienna, most explicitly. And heck, we probably wouldn't even be surprised to see it in, Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Des Moines, Iowa now, to say nothing of Los Angeles or any of the other large cities. And even on the grounds, there are other structures that seem to represent the subsidiary structures that we see when we look at these fine palace complexes. So it's not just a palace, it's actually a palace complex, because why not? And it did take them 10 years to build this ornate palace, but could anybody build a palace like this in 10 years, especially when you look at the entire palace in this image? Seeing the vast structure and the amount of area that it really encompasses. Sure. I'm certain that somebody could do this in 10 years. We just need to have more trained architects and less internet distractions, and then we'll be capable of this. And then looking in the interior, we see the very same ornate detailing that we've seen in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, in the Iowa State Capitol. Here it's reflected in Japan, because why not? Beautiful chandeliers, everything from the ceiling to the walls to the floors, well decorated and very ornate and detailed. And again, why not have gold trimming? And who knows, maybe it's real gold, because they'll tell us the same story that, much like with the Iowa State Capitol, it's cheaper to use real gold than to simply paint things gold, because that makes perfect sense. And it's much cheaper to use 27 very ornate and detailed chandeliers and hang those than just to have a simple lighting system. And we're quite familiar with those columns and pillars that are integrated in the walls, because apparently that's very easy to do as well. Just don't question it. It looks pretty, and they were able to do it. And just because it looks like palaces across the land and it's matched other palaces that we've looked at, that is not an indication that there's anything amiss here. Just take the mainstream account and don't ask questions. But how can we not? When we see this, when we really look in this kind of detail in Japan, it seems as though we have a true link to an older civilization. Here we even have a very detailed library with more of the wondrous chandeliers and the fine decorative detailing within the walls and above every single doorway. Really, I'm kind of reminded of the Iowa State Capitol here, especially with the library. Oh, yes, and then of course in this fine meeting room where we see the wondrous columns integrated in the walls, and it looks like we have two heads of state in this particular picture. I believe the individual in the lower left was recently admired by Charles Barkley. But anyway, I digress. So let's conclude the exploration. The Meiji Restoration, which was when this gentleman, Emperor Meiji, was restored as the Emperor of Japan. And during the Tokugawa shogunate, which had lasted for over 250 years, we're told that the shoguns actually had supreme authority. And this is the resignation of the last Tokugawa shogun in favor of the emperor. Although we're told that the shogun retained some power, there was a very destructive conflict. But in conjunction with that, they also decided to build this very large arsenal. And you might recall that we looked at this arsenal in Japan when we looked at our worldwide conflict that started 1847-1848. Official history tells us that this gentleman, Commodore Matthew C. Perry, was the one who had opened Japan to the rest of the world. But was that what really happened? Or was Commodore Perry leading potentially an expedition? Perhaps Commodore Perry was part of a different military, a different organization than we have a true understanding of. We know of his exploits in the Mexican War, where the United States finally pulled off a successful invasion in expeditionary format, because, according to official military history, the War of 1812 was a disaster when the United States tried to invade Canada. But they got their act together for Mexico. We remember the Reset War of 1847, and it seems to be that the Meiji Restoration reflects that, because it all falls within that time period. And if you don't recall, go back to that exploration, and we had conflicts going on all over the land from 1847 to 1870. Internal and external conflicts, social upheavals, revolutions, all over. What does it really reflect? The incredible monument the motherland calls, in the great city of Volgograd, in Russia. A monument that stands nearly 280 feet tall, completed in the 1960s to commemorate the Great Battle of World War II. Volgograd, another one of those intriguing cities that's technically within Europe, and I'm always amazed at how oftentimes we overlook the fact that much of Russia, the western portion of it, is in Europe. There are many interesting questions about the construction of this impressive monument. It happened no doubt in the 1960s, and yet there's many mysteries behind this city and these other cities within Russia. Today we're going to explore these interesting questions. You might know Volgograd by another name, Stalingrad, where the largest battle of World War II occurred, and some say the largest battle in the history of the land. Over 1 million lives ended in the battle. Some accounts say as many as 3 million lives. When we examine the history of Russia, we think that it has more of an innate desire to preserve its old world structures, and it even has the same questionable construction behind certain structures, such as the University of Moscow building. Many mysteries to be found in Russia, and yet in many ways they mirror the mysteries that we've come across in other portions of the land, whether we're exploring locations in North America, South America, Australia, Asia, of course the part of Russia that's not in Asia, and Africa, which we'll begin exploring very shortly. But I wanted to focus on Russia because there seems to be an interesting origin point. An origin point for perhaps the remnants of the civilization that preceded ours, which has been removed from the records. I also managed to acquire a lot more interesting footage that gives us a better idea of what places such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Volgograd look like in Russia. We've explored these cities before in the past, but I wanted to take a little bit of a closer look. And I also wanted to ask some more important questions about the concept, the premise of a great mud flood actually occurring here in Russia in the distant past. Russia does have an interesting history. And if you were brought up in any one of these so-called Western nations, there was a very definitive identity that was accompanied with your understanding of what Russia, or the Soviet Union, as the government that ruled Russia during the main time frame of the 20th century, specifically from after the Red Revolution or the October Revolution up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, ostensibly. Although it should be noted that the Soviet Union lasted a few years longer, until the complete collapse, depending on which version of history we're going with. And yes, it is intriguing to think that in this era of the Soviet government, which comprised most of the 20th century, we had incredible structures such as this that were built. And yet when we look at the history behind many of these structures, we find that it does seem to mirror the history that we have for the similar structures across the so-called Western world. Although that's the other interesting part about the existence of Russia and these structures, because so many of them seem to have survived, and not only have they survived, but they've also survived intact. There's also that everlasting question that we have about what the true origin of a lot of these sculptures, these monuments, really happens to be. Is this actually a structure from our particular civilization, or was it constructed by another civilization? Or is the history as we understand it complete and intact, and there's no reason to question it? Many people tell you that there are no mysteries, that everything is very easily and well documented. And yet I would counter that with a place such as Russia, and then of course in the Soviet Union, we have the same conflicting accounts that we do, especially in places such as the United States. And really that's the part I find most intriguing. Also the concept of how we identify many of these areas, these national boundaries, but not just the national boundaries that we have, but also the boundaries between the continents. There seems to be some interesting connection and correlation between many of the structures that we explore. And I don't think I have to tell frequent viewers of this channel, and a welcome to all new viewers, that we see impressive structures like this all across the land. And they share what we're informed are Roman Greco construction features. Yes, that architectural style that just seems to be all across the land. And yet you'll find some of the most impressive structures in places such as Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia. And even to this day, though, Russia continues to be a mystery for many reasons. Again, looking at the origin of many of these monuments. I always found one of the most unique connections between Russia and the United States the whole concept of the Order of St. George. It's based on the old myth of St. George slaying the dragon. And we're well aware of the myth and the legend, and of course the respective orders that exist in both Russia today and the United States, especially the United States Army, where the Order of St. George is the order for the Association of the United States Army Armor, or tanks. What's the real origin behind this legend, though? Is there a completely different story that we're not aware? Is St. George slaying the dragon that's commemorated here in Russia something that tells a completely different story, a different battle? And then, of course, looking in the interior of many of these incredible structures, this incredible and remarkable theater that defies all explanation, something that no one could build today, or at least no one would attempt to build today. Not because we lack the capability, but simply because it wouldn't be cost effective. Or a structure such as this. Could you imagine approaching some contractor anywhere in the land, Russia, China, the United States, and asking them to build a structure such as this? Now, I'm sure there are people out there that will say that yes, of course, it's possible with the right amount of financing and the right amount of time. What I always find interesting, though, is that the preponderance of these structures were constructed during a time frame before the advent of heavy machinery. The official historical explanation, especially in certain areas in Russia, is that there was a vast amount of human labor that was employed. And that may be the explanation, but when you look at the beauty behind these structures, when you see the artistic creativity and the geometric precision, and also the scale of construction, for example, the completeness of the columns, and we've seen these construction details in other locations across the land, it seems as though we have a very different picture to paint of this particular area. I'll admit in my explorations of Russia, what I'm most impressed by is they do seem to have retained the very genuine nature behind many of these old world structures, or that they haven't altered them as much as they've been altered in other places, such as the United States. There's also the usual combination that we have of unique compounds, or a collection of structures that seem to represent old world buildings that have survived a previous reset event. And yet we'll see the same kind of patterns, the same sort of layouts, and perhaps we can even speculate or posit the same theory for what purpose all of these unique compounds may have actually served. Were these structures that were purpose-built to survive the reset? What's the real purpose behind all of these domes? And why do we have the exact same sort of layout in these structures behind the land? How can you actually reconcile this with our official history? Are we to believe that all of these vastly differing nations with their different ideologies manage to share an architectural detailed knowledge across their borders and across their many differences? Or is it possible that there really was no sharing that was required, because originally they represented the same civilization? So many different questions, and to even ask them can offend many people, because many people are offended and frightened by simply asking questions, even though no offense is intended. I certainly don't mean to denigrate the people of the United States or the people of Russia, and I do concede it may be possible. And we even see the same modern inclinations in Russia with the current, what we would obviously classify as Fifth-era constructions. Tall towers of steel and glass. And whether it's Moscow or New York City, we see the same details behind them. And then we even see certain projects of renovation on some old world structures. But for whatever reason, whatever series of explanations that we can come up with, it appears that the old world structures and many of the layouts do survive entirely intact in Russia. And that very fact alone makes this an area that's worth our consideration, and our attempts to understand and explain exactly what the origin behind these structures and their original purpose really was. But you look at some of the layouts and you'll see that it does match some of the finest cities across what we would consider Western Europe. For example, many parts of St. Petersburg, in my humble opinion, rival the great cities of Venice and Pisa. But even the interiors, where we see the same immense construction. Looking overall, though, at Russia, I wanted to take a look at the good old Urbano Monte map from the 1500s, and I always want to take an excuse to take a look at this map. Let's really define the difference between Europe and Asia, or Europa and Asia. And we can see an odd assortment here. Remember that this was a map that was created by an Italian map maker in the 1500s, and we see Greenland here that's very curiously oriented more west to east. And then, of course, the usual phenomenon of land up in the Arctic or the North Pole, where we understand there to be no land but only ice to this day. We could perhaps explain that, but why is Italy, the origin of the map maker himself, so misoriented, as though it's pulled back further, and again more oriented west to east? Was that just a mistake? And then as we proceed east, trying to really understand this dividing line. As I said, many people oftentimes mistake the fact that all of Russia is considered Asia, which is not true. Western Russia, to include the great cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Volgograd, are all very definitively in Europe, the continent of Europe, even if they're not part of the political entity such as the European Union. Why is it that this mountain range of the Urals is actually a dividing line between continents? And what sort of great wonders actually exist on the east side of the Urals, or the great land of Siberia? And I've always found it very interesting that historically, the Russian exploration to the east seemed to mirror the exploration to the west in the United States, even if officially it didn't happen at the same time. Mare Tartaro. And yes, on the older maps we'll see numerous references, and even the name itself, Tartaria, Greater Tartary, and the other different variations. We also see unicorns drawn on this. Why would someone such as Urbano Monte draw these fantastic creatures? Was there a giant lizard-like sphinx creature that roamed the land and devoured unfortunate individuals? Were there devil creatures in what we may think of today as Mongolia or northwest China? There's so many different accounts behind all this, and yet we understand this to be one of the very first and most accurate maps of the land. All these connections and all this focus on what is today Russia, and then of course even China. Certain areas look rather fantastic. Ah yes, that looks like Japan. Is this the Japans, asks Anjin-san. Well, it doesn't look like the Japans, it seems like it's oriented very differently. And then of course the very incredible Strait of Anian, which today corresponds with the Bering Strait between Alaska and Siberia. And then just going a little further to the east, looking at the west coast of what is today the United States, and apparently includes western Mexico maybe. A very, very interesting change in land though. And yet we see one of the commonalities, a city that still exists today, San Francisco, and a city that comes up in many of our explorations. It appears on this Urbano Monte map from the 1580s. Do we have any Great Lakes, or do we have a different layout of lakes? So is it simply the fact that Urbano Monte did not know exactly what the lands looked like, or was he accurately recording and showing the lands as he understood them to be? It's a very interesting series of considerations. Could the lands have changed? And that's why on Urbano Monte's map they are laid out very differently. It's a question we have to continuously ask because we see this on many maps from the past. Let's take a look at the history of the land currently called Russia when it was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics from 1922 to 1991, the growth of the Russian Bear. And recall that we always look at the history and consider the way that the nations perceived each other. It's one of the ways that we understand history. From our official history, we understand that Russia took a little time before it came into the true Industrial Revolution, still under the rules of the Tsars, and even the concept of the connection of the Tsars being related perhaps to an older civilization. Now, I may not necessarily be a proponent of that theory, but it is something that I can't discount. Today, looking at how Russia expanded to the east, exploring Siberia, and there's a lot of official historical accounts about that. The old Carolingian Empire, the successor of the Frankish Empire, ruled by Charlemagne or Charles the Great, and oddly enough, the one time when there was a pan-European union that was achieved, fulfilling the dream of future pan-European advocate Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, a gentleman from Austria, and you can certainly read his book Pan-Europa, and he's written many other interesting books, as I guess some people from Austria tend to do. I find it interesting, though, that the successor states of the Carolingian Empire, both France and Germany, were involved in extreme attempts to invade Russia. Everyone's well aware of Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812, and we explored it very carefully when we explored Napoleon. Who exactly was Napoleon? Well, officially he was the Emperor of France, an individual from Corsica who rose through the ranks. And there was a recent movie made about Napoleon by Ridley Scott, which seemed to make him seem like an uninspiring character, at least in my estimation. Maybe you thought he was an inspiring character. Nothing against Joaquin Phoenix's acting, but this long march and this attempt by Napoleon to force Russia to agree to his continental system, even though the capital of Russia was well known to be St. Petersburg at the time. So was he expecting to find the Tsar in Moscow? Why did he go for Moscow? One of those interesting questions. And then in 1941, when the Third Reich commenced the largest invasion in human history, launching 3 entire army groups in order to force Russia to surrender, or the Soviet Union as it was at that time, based on the culling of officers under the Stalinist regime and the fact that the Wehrmacht assessed that they could overrun the Soviet Union. There were major sieges around the cities of St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg was under siege for over 3 years. St. Petersburg, which we've looked at and explored before. Moscow itself was very nearly threatened, but the Germans never actually captured Moscow. And then, of course, the great terrifying battle of Stalingrad, the other name for Volgograd, a name in a city that's changed numerous times, although it's interesting to note that Volgograd originally started as a giant fortress. And then the Caucasus regions. So what was the purpose behind all these invasions? We understand the concept of resources being required, but yet there's different reasons, and yet all the effort that was expended to try to invade Russia. Modern Russia was attributed to Peter the Great, pictured here. And this was a picture that Peter the Great, the Tsar, had done and then contributed to the British monarchy. Yes, I'm going to have a picture done of myself, and maybe he signed it. It's a wonderful picture. And perhaps he was simply trying to curry positive favor. Here's the throne that Peter sat on, Peter the Great, and there's even a hole in the back of it where his half-sister Sophia was stated to whisper to him matters of state. And that's another interesting character that we have, the actual family of the Tsar. And if you're interested in seeing our exploration on that, by all means, go back and take a look at the Moscow exploration. How intriguing that we actually have a monarch who is influenced by his half-sister. I don't know, it kind of reminds me of something. Not exactly sure what. Certainly nothing like an individual who sounds like Peter Ustinov being told by his snake what to do. But when we look at the official history behind this, we have the usual palace intrigue. Sophia was a very interesting character who was able to participate in politics, even if it wasn't something that a woman of the time would do. There's no doubt that this particular image is, well, how shall we say, designed to make Sophia look rather terrifying. Look at those eyes. But was that who she was really? Or was she a more sympathetic character in history? Or what exactly was her true nature? It's always intriguing to me asking these questions because this was the very formation of Russia as a considered imperial power. Peter eventually died of health issues, and there's some very horrific details behind some of the health issues that he endured before passing away in his 50s. Apparently, he had access to doctors of the Mayo Clinic caliber of the time, and they were able to relieve immense pressure on his bladder. Apparently, he had 4 pounds worth of urine that was backed up within it. What a terrible way to die. Seems like he suffered quite immensely. But why am I covering all these details? What exactly is this relevant for our exploration? We have this very rich and fascinating history of Russia, much as we do for the other European nations. So really what this tells us is that on the surface, there is no definitive difference between Russia and the other European nations, such as Germany, France, what is today the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, and so on and so forth. But looking at this very, very impressive St. Isaac's Cathedral that we've explored in St. Petersburg, a city that was called Leningrad during the Soviet regime, and also recalling the story of the Thunderstone that they put the statue of St. Peter on top of. How exactly did they get this Thunderstone in the middle of the city? And then looking at the interesting account that we have of the many monarchs in the early 20th century, or the World War I period. Of course, the final Tsar, Nicholas, the last of the Romanovs, Nicholas II. But who was Nicholas really? What was his exact role within this civilization? And why is it that we have a very, very interesting and close resemblance between Nicholas II and other monarchs at that time? Now, if you're not familiar with history, is this individual here pictured Nicholas II, or is this someone else? I'm not going to tell you because I'm asking you right now. Do you know the difference? And, of course, if you're from the United Kingdom or study history, you know that this is King George V. And yet he bears a very striking resemblance to Nicholas II, or Nicholas II bears a striking resemblance to him. The reason I'm highlighting this is that we believe that we have this very well-detailed historical account of who these monarchs were. But who exactly were these individuals? Why do they have so many familiar features? And it's not just members of the monarchy or ranking members of the government where we see this phenomenon occur. Now, of course, we'll have the usual explanation that, yes, of course, there's similarities in the appearance of certain human beings, and that's how we can account for this. And, of course, that many of these individuals were from the same family. Although, it's rather intriguing trying to deconflict the exact details that we have behind many of these monarchies and their families, especially when you consider the amount of, how shall we say, finding a certain breeding path that led to the families not having a very good genetic diversity, at least as we understand science to that day. And there's also the interesting case of Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, or actually hailing from Prussia, when Germany was unified under the rule of Prussia. Kaiser Wilhelm II, quite an interesting individual, and even more unique is, in addition to his love for elaborate military uniforms, he actually seemed to like wearing military uniforms of other nations. Here he's with Tsar Nicholas II, and they've switched uniforms. Not too much difference aside from the hat and the spiked helmet. And of course they both have the fancy boots. What is really going on, though, again, with all these individuals, this royalty? They seem to have a very close relationship. And here's another image that we have of Kaiser Wilhelm II wearing a Turkish field marshal's uniform. Well, I guess at least that makes sense. They were allies, but why would he go gallivanting around in the uniforms of other nations, whether they were allies or not? It's all very intriguing, especially when we look at the very interesting relationship that we have between Russia, Western Europe, and of course the United States. World War I, the war to end all wars, the Great War, the many different names for it, occurring from 1914 to 1918, and we've looked at it in the channel before. Unyielding trench warfare, fought on multiple fronts in Europe. And you can certainly see in a little cartoon like this why an image like this would no doubt inflame the patriotic notions behind many Americans. And you've got the good old recruiting poster of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you." And thus the United States entered into World War I and brought about a successful conclusion for the Western Allies. Of course, the American adventure in World War I proved to be a very difficult one. The other nations were fighting since 1914, and the sudden introduction of American manpower changed the scale of the war in favor of the Western Allies, overcoming what was called the Central Powers at the time. This is a very interesting photo, though, from Camp Funston in Kansas that was taken shortly after World War I ended. If you served recently in the United States military, you're well aware of the fact that Camp Funston, which is off of Fort Riley, Kansas today, was where military transition teams that served in Afghanistan were trained. But in this particular time frame, circa 1918 to 1919, it was a hospital. dealing with the outbreak of the Spanish flu at the time. And we see some interesting details in some of these images. I'm always amazed at how these images, in a way, appear very contemporary. And looking at the details, for example, we'd expect everyone to be wearing masks, given the fact that we understand that face masks would protect people, or at least we know that this image is not from Madison, Wisconsin in 2020, because everybody would certainly be wearing their masks. This, what looks to be an officer, I'm not sure, is certainly not wearing a mask. And most of the individuals in this image are not wearing masks. So what really to make of this? It's quite intriguing. What did the Americans sign up for, though, in World War I? Well, they thought that they were going to be fighting the Germans, the Central Powers, and assisting France and Great Britain in preventing the Germans from capturing Paris. But one thing Americans probably didn't expect was the fact that they were actually going to be participating in an intervention in Russia. Now, it wasn't an invasion. There's a very subtle difference between an invasion and an intervention. This was an intervention because Russia was in a civil war at that time. The Bolsheviks, or the Red Russians, were fighting the anti-Bolsheviks, or the White Russians. And the United States moved to help its allies, namely the United Kingdom or Great Britain, by landing at Archangel, where a large American contingent landed of nearly 5,000 American soldiers. So yes, officially, there were American soldiers present in Russia at the end of World War I. There were all sorts of reports that the Americans that participated in this little expedition were not exactly pleased about it, and that morale was low. There was also a large American contingent of 5,000 soldiers sent to Vladivostok, off of eastern Siberia and the Coldwater port there. How intriguing. And it's also yet another account that we have of this interesting international intervention that seemed to occur all this time. The United States was not the only nation that sent foreign soldiers to intervene in Russia's conflict. There was also participants from Czechoslovakia, Great Britain, and Japan. In fact, according to the official accounts, it seems that Japan sent the most number of soldiers to intervene in this conflict. Yet, despite this intervention, we know how the Russian Civil War ended up with a Bolshevik victory and the foundation of the Union of Soviet Social, the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's been a while since I've said it. I used to just roll it right off the tongue. And here we have a picture showing the officers. Ah, yes, that must be the American. There's just something about him that just says United States Army within that intense look. A look that hasn't changed. And here we have General Richardson, the American general that was sent to extract the force from Archangel, Russia, after morale had gotten a little low. There were even rumors of mutinies. Of course, these rumors were fervently denied. Who exactly knows what happened? Although I gotta say, this General Richardson, who was a graduate of the United States Military Academy in the 1800s, looks like he'd be a great individual to play offensive line for the Army team today. The evacuation was successful, and the operation was forgotten. Are you aware that there was a very interesting financial arrangement, though, between the United States and its former allies, well, actually its current allies, and then its former antagonists after World War I? This is a picture that shows the culture of the Weimar Republic, that government that existed in Germany between the Kaiser and, of course, the Third Reich. And how exactly was this government funded? Well, we have this very interesting account where we had Wall Street bankers that provided loans to Great Britain so they could fight World War I, and then Great Britain paid back those loans to the United States from war reparations from Germany. But the war reparations for Germany were also being funded by loans from the United States. So what a very, very interesting and convoluted picture that we have. The United States was providing loans to its allies during the war, sensible enough. But then after the war, it was providing loans to Germany so that it could repay reparations to the former adversarial nations. And then the money that was being paid to its former adversarial nations as part of the Treaty of Versailles was then coming back to the U.S. Treasury. So I guess they always say follow the money, but you end up with a very vicious circle of infinity. Or as the banker J.B. Johnston in the TV series Miami Vice, a Wall Street banker, fictional of course, said, "Those of us who have money can make more of it by loaning it to those who don't." And not so long ago, our bank loaned a lot of money to our allies in Germany and France. Or excuse me, in Great Britain and France. Of course, then they loaned money to Germany, so then they could repay those reparations. And it was called the Dawes Plan. And what a very interesting financial arrangement. And I highlight this because this shows all this unique cooperation that we have. Now you're probably going to ask, did Great Britain ever pay back all the money that the United States loaned it during World War I? The answer is yes, but it wasn't until relatively recently. They loaned them a lot of money. And we know that the Dawes Plan collapsed with the Great Depression, or the stock market crash in the United States in 1929. That's what happens when you have one nation funding everything. There's also the fact that the United States, again showing its very ambivalent relationship with the Soviet Union or Russia, much as Europe always seems to have a very ambivalent relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, provided Russia with a lot of key materials as part of the Land Lease program during World War II to ensure that the Soviet Union was able to prosecute a successful war against the terrifying enemy, Nazi Germany. And of course, everybody understood that's exactly what the conflict was all about, and that was the main goal. So it could at least explain why the United States seems to have switched its foreign policy, or at least its consideration of the Soviet Union. Remember that right at the end of World War I, President Wilson was willing to send American soldiers, large contingents, after fighting in the trenches, to go to Russia to try to prevent the Bolsheviks from taking power. But then, by World War II, that foreign policy had shifted, there was a more threatening adversary, so now the United States decided to ship equipment to the Soviet Union to enable it to successfully fight that war. How intriguing. Always going back and forth on this foreign policy. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is anything out of the ordinary. It's just interesting to me that there's always this unique interest from the Western world in Russia or the Soviet Union. And how much did the United States provide the Soviet Union? Well, just recap it real quick. 427,000 trucks, 6,300 combat vehicles, half-tracks, 7,000 tanks. Don't you find that amazing, since we know that the Soviet Union built some of the very best tanks, and quite a few of them, the venerable T-34, during World War II. But they also had American equipment. 11,400 aircraft, 2,000 ambulances, 35,000 motorcycles. We'll have to say, with all those motorcycles, it looks like the Soviet Union could have built themselves some very robust motorcycle reconnaissance units for World War II. And what about logistics? You know how I always love to talk about and think about logistics. The United States provided them 1,977 locomotives, 11,000 specialized cars, 4,400,000 tons of food. That's a lot of food. No doubt rations, but then look at this. 53% of the total U.S. ammo production, 57% of Soviet aviation fuel, and then apparently they took factories too. Boy, moving factories in Soviet Union was just such a big thing during World War II. They moved their own factories, and then they brought in factories from the United States. So no wonder, with all this equipment and all of these wondrous logistics the United States was able to produce during World War II, that when World War II ended, that they just happened to throw it off the side of the ship. And don't you find it even more interesting that when we did the reset barren exploration, recall that the United States began taxing a much greater portion of its citizenry to pay for World War II. And then in more recent conflicts, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States also left behind a lot of military equipment. Here we have an M1A1 tank that has been acquired by ISIS. And here we have a United States-made high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, Humvee, that's been acquired and used by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Well, I guess you can say at least this equipment wasn't tossed in the ocean to rot, and somebody's at least getting some use out of it. I always wondered, why instead of just throwing the equipment in the ocean, maybe the United States just should have provided all that equipment to the Soviet Union. It would have made a better diplomatic relation, right? And here's just some of the military equipment that the United States left behind in Afghanistan. That kind of surprised me to see 3 C-130s, over 3,000 Humvees, 33 Black Hawk helicopters. Yes, it's rather amazing. I mean, we're not talking about just a few rounds or a couple rifles here. We're talking about over 3,000 M4 carbines. What a series of military logistics that have now gone to equip the Taliban. I'm not questioning policy, it's just really intriguing when you look at all the details behind this. It's also interesting to note when someone tried to calculate what the cost was of the United States interventions in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Originally, the number was a lot lower. Now, of course, if you'll look it up today, you certainly won't see something listed in the hundreds of billions, but you'll see a number up to the trillions, either $4 to $8 trillion. But going on past the United States military adventures of the past, present, and future, one thing I find interesting is all these international foreign interventions that occurred. Prior to the international foreign intervention that occurred in the Russian Civil War after World War I, circa 1919, we had the foreign intervention that occurred in the so-called Boxer Rebellion in China. Why is it we have all these different armies deciding to cooperate and move into a particular land area? Why is it always in Asia? Or why is it always in the same general vicinity? Is the history exactly as we understand it, or is something else going on? Does it somehow mirror the social revolutions of 1848 in Europe? And yet, if you look at the official history, you'll find out that many of the leaders of the social revolutions of 1848 in Europe ended up serving as generals, mostly for the Union, in the United States Civil War. And then, of course, there's that conflict that they, for whatever reason, just don't talk about so much in American history, and that was when the Fenian forces went and raided Canada. And who were the Fenians, you ask? They were Irish soldiers who had served in both the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War, who apparently weren't tired enough of conflict and decided to go attack Canada. And in Canada, this event is more well remembered. Like here we see a formation of the Canadian militia, about to engage in a very significant battle against the Fenians. Although it's rather intriguing to note that the casualties behind these battles were very, very low. So, not exactly sure what to make of it. What exactly was the nature of these conflicts? How exactly was the United States, which was very well armed at the end of the Civil War and still had a very large standing army in the field, and let's not forget one of the great captains of American military history, of course I'm not saying captain is an official rank, but as a reference, General Ulysses S. Grant, allow this to happen? Some say it was because of the poor leadership of President Andrew Johnson at the time. Who knows for sure? Or was there something else going on? And let's not forget the Crimean War, yet another international cooperation that occurred to attack Russia in Crimea. Or were they fighting Russia on behalf of Turkey? Or was something else entirely going on? I'm always amazed looking at these uniforms. I have to give these soldiers credit, wearing these vast amounts of clothing in extreme weather instead of just wool uniforms. So it all goes back to that question that we have: what exactly was happening in history? Were these conflicts exactly as we were told that they were? Or do they represent something else entirely? Do they represent the final phase of finishing a previous reset, where what remained of any vestiges of the old order or the old civilization were completely swept away? Who knows for sure? It's up to you to decide. So looking at this background, what do we have with Russia? Looking at St. Petersburg, we have no shortage of images that seem to show abandoned cities, such as St. Petersburg here. We can certainly appreciate the fact that St. Petersburg endured a very terrifying siege during World War II. But what exactly do these images really tell us? Do they give us the inclination or indication that perhaps the structures and even the entire city or the original city layout of St. Petersburg has a very different origin than what we understand? Could it even be possible that these cities and the very eastern end of European Russia, as we define it, might have an entirely different origin? There's something rather strange to me about the fact that the Urals is the dividing line between the two continents of Asia and Europe. Why is that? If that's the fact that mountains can divide continents, then why is, say, for example, the Rockies in the United States not a dividing line between two continents? Thinking back to that earlier indication that we had on the Urbana-Monte map. There's no shortage of images of incredible and elaborate structures that were constructed during a time that official history tells us that most of the people of Russia under the rule of the Tsar were simple peasants or serfs, those who were stuck to the land that they were on. And yet we see incredible architectural achievements. Now, whatever the veracity of these images that we're looking at, if these were actual photos taken from the date that we understand them as official history tells us, or have they been changed over time? Again, it doesn't mean that there was necessarily a conspiracy. Maybe the photos were just touched up. Maybe they were transferred from one book to another. Maybe the album changed them. Of course, learning official history in the United States, one of the things that we were informed is that there was a lot of propaganda that happened, especially once the Soviet regime took over. And if you watch the miniseries Chernobyl, then you have the understanding that there was not a lot of trust and faith within the Soviet government. So what from the historical account was changed? That's the kind of question that we have to ask. And of course, it's the same question that I ask considering anything with the United States. The layout of St. Petersburg has always impressed me. The layout of the city and its actual origin. And going back and trying to reconcile its existence on earlier maps in terms of what its exact layout was. Much like when we looked at Volgograd, trying to understand the origin of the city. Did it all start with a very simple star fort structure? What exactly was the origin of St. Isaac's Cathedral? And why is it that we have all these impressive details, the same construction details that we see in other cities? The domes, the pediments, the columns. Well, once again, official history will tell you that Russia admired the incredible constructions across Europe, and of course the return to Roman Greco constructions. They wanted to emulate them. Yes, I suppose you can accept that. You can also accept the story that the Kremlin in Moscow was done by an architect out of Italy. But you look at some of these other images, and it gives you the impression of a much more integrated and impressive transportation system. We see trolleys in many locations. And here in this interesting artwork, trying to understand what a repurposing, or dare I even say a salvaging, of old technology from the past really was. Is that what the Industrial Revolution was to represent? And was it the same thing in Russia and eventually the Soviet Union with the 5-year plans that it was in the rest of the land, especially the United Kingdom and the United States? We even have these impressive interiors, whether it's the Winter Palace or the Grand Palace or any of the other numerous incredible palaces that are across Russia. And make no mistake about it, they are some of the finest palaces in the land. But how exactly were they constructed? What's the real origin and history behind these cities? And why are we really looking at the possibility of a theory of a mud flood in this area? Well, going off of alternative research, there do seem to be a lot of origin points of, at least the theories, coming from Russia or the Soviet Union. But is that by design, or is that just because that's where the theories were allowed to survive? Or is it also because of the fact that, due to our understanding that we can't trust, again going off the official historical evaluation from the United States, the history of the Soviet Union, now Russia, then perhaps that leaves room for understanding that nothing of our theories is without question. Well, the truth of the matter is, history can always be questioned. History is always being reevaluated. I recall one of my very first deep dives into history, and it was evaluating a book called Enemy at the Gates, which coincidentally was a book written by author William Craig about the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, this book came out in the early 1970s, and William Craig had access to first-hand accounts. In other words, veterans that had actually participated in the battle. But because of the existence of the Iron Curtain at that time, or the East-West divide with the so-called Cold War, Craig was only able to interview the German veterans. So we really didn't get an account from the Soviet side of the conflict. That came later. But what's interesting to me is, because of the fact that we have these two great powers, one that was decisively defeated in World War II, and another whose government collapsed officially in 1991, what's exactly the true history? And keep in mind, we're only talking about World War II here. And this was something that perplexed me when I did my initial historical studies, because I can remember the history of many of the details of World War II have been, how shall we say, revised over time. I'm not suggesting that there's a conspiracy, merely stating that because different sources became available, that certain accounts were changed. There were details behind the Battle of Stalingrad that were changed. There were details behind major operational and campaign plans that were changed. And so, because of that, there doesn't even need to be a conspiracy for the history not to be correctly understood. But then you run into another problem when you engage in historical revision. How is it you can know with a clearer detail what happened with more intervening years? In other words, how can we know more clearly in 2021 what happened in 1941 than we did in 1971? That's always a question that comes up when you're actually trying to study history, and it's an ongoing problem. It's a challenge. Now, of course, we have defined authorities and we have genuine certified historians who are going to give you the final evaluation on what happened. And keep in mind that official historians, along with scientists, are the people that can tell you the difference between a legitimate conspiracy that occurred or has occurred and merely a conspiracy theory. And make no mistakes about it, I am not a certified historian. So, just letting you know that and being honest with all of you. So, these explorations really trying to understand what we see here. Looking at this from an intellectual perspective, trying to be as objective as possible. And there are a lot of great historians who've never set foot in Russia. And yet they seem to have a good idea of exactly what happened. I think of the accounts of Potemkin. Here, looking at this particular image in Moscow, and we see some of this interesting slant construction. You have these very rudimentary horses and carts, and you have this incredibly elaborate and beautiful architecture. Now again, trying to answer that question, when exactly was this structure constructed? How was it constructed? Why is it that we're not doing this again? And keep in mind, these were not built as standalone structures. Whether we're looking at St. Petersburg or Moscow, these are vast city blocks. And go back to the beginning of the exploration and take a look at the actual video footage that we have of these very, very impressive layouts in these incredible cities. How much has survived from the past and what's changed over time? Remember that the most destructive battles in human history, and we're not just talking about aerial bombardments, these were land battles. The city of Stalingrad, Volgograd now, was completely destroyed by both an air and a land battle. St. Petersburg was under siege for 3 years. And Moscow itself did not escape the direct effects, even if the city was not engaged in a direct battle. The German forces did come very close to Moscow in 1941. But it was never under a state of extended siege or cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. So these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask when we look at these images. Why is it that the origin of a lot of these theories did come out of Russia or the former Soviet Union? Or did they? Is that just simply our understanding of it? Yes, I know. Even understanding the history of alternative research is questionable. It's why you really have to rely on yourself and your own objective observations. And as I always say, the history may well have unfolded just the way that we were told it was. But with every single exploration, with every single detail, and every new revelation that we have, that appears to be less and less likely. Now, there may be other explanations for this, and going back and looking at the great city of Stalingrad, Volgograd, or Tsaristan, as it was originally known as. So many different names. So many different names for one city. It originally started off as a fortress, and it grew up rather rapidly in the early 1900s. Some of the architecture remains to this day. How much of this architecture is original, and how much of it has been modified over time. When you really look into the history behind these great cities in what is today Russia, you'll find the same conflicting accounts. You'll even find the same history of renovations, the same rather bizarre history of architects. Certain structures that simply have an architect assigned to them, and yet no history of contractors. Well, of course, that's easily explained. In Russia, they just had forced labor, especially during the reign of the Tsar. That's what the official history will tell you. Look up the history of the construction of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Why didn't Napoleon go for St. Petersburg again? I mean, certainly he knew it was the capital city and that's where the Tsar would be, but he decided to go for Moscow? That one never really made a lot of sense to me, but maybe it was just another one of those random blunders that Napoleon made, despite being so perfect for so long. All these cities, all these battles, and all this destruction, and yet we have the same patterns that we've seen in other places in the land. Conflict, assimilation, indoctrination. Russia is certainly no different with its official history, and there's many strange parallels that we've talked about with the history of the United States. The exploration of lands, the ongoing conflict, the unfortunate indigenous peoples who seem to simply be in the way of national expansion. Again, at least that's what the official history said. Or was there something else entirely different that was happening, that were simply concealed by certain events that were reported in a different facet? Why do we have what appears to be more advanced technology present in these early photographs of the city of Volgograd? What exactly does it allude to? Well, it's the same clues that we've seen in cities all across the land. I think about some of the cities we've explored in the United States, such as Janesville in Wisconsin, where we see random isolated locations. And also remember, was there something in Volgograd, or Stalingrad as it was known as during World War II, that necessitated such an intense conflict? Yes, of course, official history will tell us that just because of the name of the city, it was why German Army Group South clashed with many army groups of the Red Army, and an epic conflict occurred. There's even other strange historical anomalies, such as this interesting Orthodox church that was on a boat. What a very well-constructed church on a boat that went up and down the River Volga. Is this something that really happened? Isn't this intriguing when you think about where these designs go to this day? And then, of course, the same history that we have of monasteries, convents. In fact, recall Peter the Great's half-sister Sophia. She ended her life by being confined to a convent. It seems that Peter the Great had overcome her, and that's why that image seemed to show a different person. So a very interesting and conflicted history with many conflicting accounts, much as we have in the United States. But yet, no less an example of many architectural beauties and wonders. And so, in summary, what do we really have with this Europa mud flood? What do we have with some of these modern structures that endure to this day? Was this particular church rebuilt recently, as history would indicate? Or is it merely a renovated old world structure that's been attributed to construction? For that fact, with the original monument that we looked at, The Motherland Calls, what's the history behind it? And then we have this very interesting planetarium in Volgograd, Russia. Now, this has quite the interesting history behind it. This was a gift from East Germany to the Stalin Soviet Union in the 1950s. Now, being aware of history like we are, we understand that East Germany was completely destroyed as a nation, as was West Germany for that fact. Their infrastructure was destroyed, their entire nation was defeated and occupied. And yet so soon, before an economic recovery could even occur, they were building structures such as this. They somehow built this structure, this planetarium in Volgograd, Stalingrad at the time, and provided it as a gift for their new, what do we say? We won't say conquerors, do we say liberators? Or are they considered in an intervention? We always have all these different terms. But I'm very impressed that East Germany was able to build a structure like this impressive planetarium. Ah, yes, another one of these interesting planetariums. And we see that it has a lot of old world architecture to it. It's fascinating to note that there's still structures that have a construction date from the 1950s that still have a lot of question marks around them. And I would say that this planetarium is no different. And I just wanted to highlight this one specific example in this particular exploration because it intrigued me. It's an example of a structure that has a more recent construction date, the 1950s, but trying to reconcile the official history is very intriguing. How exactly was East Germany able to build this? Did they build it, or did they simply provide the finances that they clearly didn't have to allow local construction contractors in Stalingrad at the time to erect this incredible planetarium with these impressive columns and these very unique designs and symbols? And yet, for whatever reason, they're using symbols that we've seen in other old world structures that don't seem to make a lot of sense. I would very much like to visit this planetarium in Volgograd off the River Volga and really try to ascertain what its origin is and the construction materials. I would really like to gain an understanding for how it was brought up so quickly and what it really represents. Because it seems as though this structure, for whatever reason, just looking at the images of it, appears to be a lot older than we might think it would be. Why is it we always have these stories of these structures with these interesting origins, with these unique stories that just don't seem to add up? I mean, of course, it's a planetarium, so we're going to see a lot of displays that commemorate space exploration. Now, keep in mind, in the 1950s, according to the official history, the Soviet Union was leading space exploration at that time. The United States had to catch up. The Soviet Union put the first satellite into orbit, officially. But going past all that, looking at all the impressive architecture within this planetarium, why exactly would such an elaborate and classical planetarium be constructed? What exactly does it represent? And look closely at these symbols. Tell me where we've seen these symbols before, because yes, they have appeared before. And what's the origin behind this particular walk and the construction of the structure itself? It's quite fascinating because it really is a conflicting account. And yet from every visible indication, it does appear to be a legitimate old world structure. And really that's one of the difficult issues that we have of how the historical account becomes obfuscated over time. And whether we're talking about a hospital in Rochester, Minnesota that was constructed in the late 1880s, or a very impressive Art Deco building that was built in the 1920s in New York City, or of course a planetarium here in Volgograd, Russia, we seem to have the exact same questions and the exact same account behind these impressive icons, these structures, these symbols. What exact construction material was used in this? Now, an interesting facet with the Motherland Calls Monument, in addition to the fact that it's being considered to be inducted as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument, is the fact that there's been numerous renovations that have been required on it. It is built of concrete officially. But if you have something with, how shall we say, more of an officially authoritarian government, then does it become possible to obfuscate things? And I just thought I'd include a few images of what this planetarium looks like today, and you can see that it seems to have the latest of the great, how shall we say, Apple generation, with wonderful lights and neon effects placed in it. Yet, even with these, how shall we say, modern lighting arrangements, we can still see the old world architecture that endures, such as with the stairs and the banister, and then of course the columns here. And then even some of the detailing where the columns actually meet the ceiling. Are they load-bearing or are they simply for decorative purposes? Another question that we always ask. And then even the fact that with the lighting we can still see the original focus of the structure. Whatever its actual origin and original purpose, if it had one, it still survives today as a very beautiful structure. Something that seems to indicate that there's something more interesting going on. This planetarium that you can still visit today if you go to Volgograd, Russia. Now, of course, I know what you're saying. Yes, most of us are in the Western nations. That's probably not going to be happening anytime soon as a result of our current political situation with Russia. And I think that's a very unique note to end this part of the exploration on, because there are many incredible sights in Russia. There is the fact that we do have that interesting divide line with the Ural Mountains. The unique historical accounts of entire factories being moved from European Russia to the other side of the Urals during the German invasion in 1941. And then, of course, there's interesting sights in the Urals, these incredible rocks, at least that's what we understand them to be. Incredible stones, or incredible rock formations might be the best way to describe them, of truly impressive colossal size. What exactly are these? Now, by all means, let me know what you think in the comments, and I welcome all opinions. If you think they're just rocks, they're just rocks. There's even other strange accounts across Russia, such as this particular church that was flooded as the result of a dam being constructed. And this is a very unique site because you'd be surprised to know that there are actually more accounts of this particular situation happening, and not just in Russia, where as a result of a change of the flow of water, the construction of a dam, or a dam being damaged, that we end up having the remnants of a very legitimate old world structure being flooded, and then of course it being surrounded by water. This has to be one of the more interesting accounts that we have of this. And then even on the nearby quote-unquote shore, we still have old world buildings, this once being part of a very large and impressive church. Now, do you think that this is a legitimate old world structure that was concealed? Now, granted that this dam, the construction of it was by order of Joseph Stalin, but looking at it from different angles, we have different impressions behind it. This is definitely a site that I would very much appreciate exploring on site. I can only imagine how many details could be found with it. And if you think of the fact of exploring certain structures on site, there is a lot more to be gleaned. For example, I think of some of the most impressive structures that I've explored within the United States, and they're not in the places I would have expected. I would say that some of the most impressive construction material I've encountered has been the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa. I know you thought I was going to say Iowa State Capitol. It's really good, but the exterior of the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines is something otherworldly. And then, of course, the entire construction of the Plummer Building in Rochester, Minnesota. So I have to wonder, what exact conclusions could I come to going to Russia and exploring these impressive structures, exploring these amazing rock formations? What exactly are these in the Urals? What do they represent? Why is there still so much mystery that's associated with this area? And of course, people say there are no mysteries, but they're the people who don't want to actually consider that perhaps we haven't actually answered everything that's out there. There's nothing unscientific about saying, I don't know. In fact, I recall Data saying that one of the most fundamental admissions for anyone is simply stating, I don't know. I don't know what the origin of this structure is. And I don't know exactly why it was flooded. But I have many theories behind it. And I think that's what makes Russia such an incredible place. Was there a mud flood in Europa? Is there something that's very significant about this gateway, this dividing line of the Urals, that divides officially the continent of Europe from Asia? Why is there so much focus on it? Well, please stand by and continue watching.
His savior, did he have a gauntlet of steel?
Why, yes. Do you know him?
Aye, all too well, damn his heart.
Welcome, channel members, and once again, I have returned to continue our explorations. I've had a wonderful week being on the ground, on my own, exploring some very unique sites. Once in a while, we all need to get away a little bit, and I'm no different in that respect. I've taken a Myers-Briggs personality test, about 20 years ago, and it told me that I'm actually an ambivert. In other words, sometimes I can be extroverted, sometimes I can be introverted. Now, those of you who've been on the channel a while know that I'm probably not a person who really puts a lot of validity in such a test, and that assessment is absolutely true. It is interesting, though, to see how we are categorized and pigeonholed. One thing I'm a proponent of now, we should all be ourselves, and we should all embrace ourselves. So I embrace myself the way I am. Now, you might recall that I have a lot of interest in the Midwest, and right now in this little overlay here on good old Google Maps, you can see many of the sites that I've explored and I've shared. Now, this is not an all-comprehensive overlay. In fact, I probably have about 9 or 10 different overlays. It's just how I organize my thoughts. One of the things I haven't done yet, though, is I haven't done any sort of geographical analysis in terms of how these sites of interest relate to one another, but I'll be getting to that eventually. I know, it's the whole ley lines discussion again. But you might be aware of the fact that I have a very different perception of ley lines. And it's not to say that I think any other alternative researcher, or any other researcher for that fact, is incorrect about ley lines. I just have a different, unique way that I want to approach it. Back to the origin of the channel, one of the first places I took a look at was La Crosse, which is technically in the state of Wisconsin in the Mississippi River Valley. A very interesting area because it appears, after many of our explorations, that the Mississippi River Valley was an area of refuge, where individuals seem to try to survive the last reset between the Fourth Era and the current era. And the evidence for this is the immense presence of many different old world structures. However, what's even more interesting, though, is the valley seems to contain that whole concept of the existence of a previous civilization. And the other reason I'm always so interested in a place like Iowa, and today our exploration is going to focus on Dubuque, is because of the fact that there are numerous examples of overlapping civilizations. Now, of course, we won't be informed that. We'll be told that Iowa was settled in the 1830s and people came in very quickly and they built the entire state out of essentially nothing in a very short amount of time. Officially, there's really no natural materials of value in Iowa. Yes, it's one of the most beautiful breadbasket areas and agrarian state in the entire world. That's what the official history tells us. It is very pretty, but it's also considered flyover country currently. Dubuque, though, going down the Mississippi River from La Crosse is very intriguing because there's many things that we've already looked at in the immediate vicinity. You might recall that we've looked at the Basilica of St. Francis Xavier in the nearby town of Dyersville. And then from a more pop culture aspect, Dyersville is where they have the Field of Dreams. Also interesting is we're not too far from the Anamosa State Prison. We're also in vicinity of Stone City, where they found all this incredible limestone. And then there's also the caves here, the Crystal Lake Cave, which ties back into some of the legends that we have of the people of Dyersville. Go back and watch those interesting explorations, and if you need a reference, let me know. But why Dubuque is so interesting is that it appears to have the evidence of multiple civilizations, multiple eras that are layered. And what is this evidence, you ask? Well, let's take a look at our good old bird's eye view of Dubuque from 1889. Now, the official history tells us that Dubuque was settled primarily in the 1830s, and that's when it was incorporated, one of the very first cities in Iowa, when it was settled. Before it was a state and it was a territory. However, they try to say that the founder, the city that the person is named after, Julian Dubuque, had absolutely nothing to do with the founding of the city. He was just some guy who showed up in the late 1700s, passed away in 1810, a good 20 years before anybody even thought of a settlement there, and he mined lead after an agreement with the Native Americans, the Meskwaki tribe. Again, this is all the official account. But what's really intriguing when you look at this 1880s bird's eye view of Dubuque is you see your classic river city, and you might notice that some river cities seem to have more old world architecture. I strongly advise, if you have the ability, to visit Dubuque, because what you'll find is many of the structures that are displayed in this bird's eye view still exist to this day. Some have been cared for, modernized, renovated, and some have simply been left to, well, dare I say, decay on their own devices. And yet, many structures, such as these two houses here, still stand to this day. And it's very impressive to talk about the construction capability when you think about the fact that something that they built officially over 150 years ago, if not more, is still standing to this day despite being neglected for decades. Take a modern house, for example. If you had a house that was built in 2012 and you neglected it for 20 years, how do you think it would be doing? Now, on to the prime example of what we're looking at in this exploration. So in Dubuque, they have these extensive bluffs where the terrain overlooks the valley. And this is easily explainable from a mainstream perspective that does make a little bit of sense in the fact that this area is known for flooding. And there's been many nasty floods that Dubuque and the Mississippi River Valley have incurred over the past century, and more. Yet, interestingly enough, by these bluffs and depicted on this bird's eye view, you have these retaining walls. And these indeed are the Great Walls of Iowa. These retaining walls with these very large limestones. And they even have one of these old elevator trains, funicular, if I'm pronouncing that properly. I'm probably not, but that's all right because it seems like a made-up word anyway. And it was an incline train that allowed people simply to ride a little car up to the top because walking up these curvy roads and these terraces was not the easiest thing to do. But the presence of these retaining walls is what's interesting to me, and these retaining walls continue to exist to this day. For example, in what is today Loras College, and this structure is still present. There are some very stupendous structures that are available on Loras College. It also has an interesting history in and of itself that we'll be looking at. But we're going to focus on the retaining walls as we move on with this exploration. So what's so intriguing about these retaining walls? Well, you can see in this image here, these are stated to be very large limestone blocks. And what we're looking at is a little tunnel that they built for the original elevator, as they called it, to pass through. Yes, they not only built a gigantic retaining wall, and you can see how large these limestones that they say are readily available in the valley were cut from, but they also decided to build a passageway. And of course, we have our usual complex arrangement of these stones. And these stones are huge, but yet they were cut so precisely, and yet, oddly enough, the official history of Dubuque doesn't have the contractor that did this or any history of establishing this. They talk about some of the recent issues they've had with some of the ground giving way. But you can see in these images, though, that these blocks are very old, and yet someone put an immense engineering effort. This is still the backbone of the city of Dubuque, especially in the bluffs. This is what holds the terrain together through the rain, through the floods. It's a very impressive engineering achievement, yet no one knows exactly who did it. In a town that has a very, or city I should say, a city that has a very well-documented history. And you even see it right here. An analysis revealed that a mass limestone retaining wall would be cost prohibitive. Wait a minute, what? So what they're saying is that when they had the terrain, a large rainfall that washed some of it away, and they had a portion of the wall that collapsed, and we'll take a look at that, they were going to replace it. But just replacing this small portion of a mass limestone retaining wall is cost prohibitive. And so they decided that what they were going to do is they were just going to construct a facade and do it around concrete. And that's how they were going to replace a section of the wall that had fallen out. Really? That's their answer to this? And here you can see in this image, this is what had happened. Now it's pretty clear that the terrain had given away. Could it have been that there was some engineering failure that finally transpired with this original infrastructure? Because remember, we don't know how old this wall is. And I am positing a theory that this wall may well have been a remnant from an earlier era. Now, again, it could have been from the Fourth Era, the Tartarian era, or the Monument Builder era, however we want to refer to it as. But I have inclinations that what was really happening is that when people came out of the reset, that this was something that was still available and still present from an even earlier era. So again, who knows how old this original structure actually is? And so really think about that, these retaining walls, the size of these limestones. Also consider the composition of this material. Is this really limestone, or is this some sort of much more advanced construction material? Now, once again, people can deride that opinion and say, well, we're told what it is. And yet, at the same time, and yes, I use that expression a lot because we're supposed to believe two conflicting ideas at the same time, which is why I use that expression a lot. And yes, I use it a lot as a teacher, and yes, it did get me in trouble. We're supposed to believe, though, that they can't actually replicate this, or just cutting the limestone, they can't do it. So therefore, they have to manufacture a facade, which is just a facade of limestone around a concrete. That's how they're saying they're going to repair this unfortunate destruction of this wall. So all very interesting, all conflicting ideas and multiple things that are supposed to be true at the same time, even though they can't be. You can also find images of Dubuque of the 11th Street elevator and what it originally looked like. And of course, you won't see a close-up image, but you can see it on your own, and it's very impressive. And then we're also supposed to believe that they built this retaining wall over the elevator. And you'll find no shortage of postcards with it. And yet in this postcard, it shows that they've already built the retaining wall, and it looks like it's always been there. Yet in images, it's almost as though it's airbrushed out. Now, I'm not saying that's what's happened. I'm just saying that's how it looked. There's also the fact that many of the residents that had built their houses, and I do believe those houses seem to show signs of construction from our current era, although they do have a little bit more opulence to them. So perhaps it was a little mixture of retained knowledge, and then they built wooden houses that are very impressive. One of the impressive houses up there is called the Hancock House, which you can stay at to this day as a bed and breakfast. Although I notice that it does not have a masonry exterior construction like some other old world bed and breakfasts that you can stay at. So don't expect the noise to be drowned out, because it's wooden construction and has single pane windows, it appears, at least when I looked at it on the ground a while back. But you can see here with the 11th Street elevator, very impressive, and yet the retaining wall already had this tunnel built in it. So which came first? Well, it's hard to say. It's another example of conflicting accounts. And remember, these are postcards, although are these real images, or are these merely a compilation of images? You always have to wonder about all these things and question it extensively. So are they really showing us what happened? Is this what it really looked like? Is this an actual picture? Or is this something else itself? Because it's not a very good picture, and you always get that no higher resolution available. Of course, why would you? But there's other unique anomalies across the city of Dubuque. For example, Dubuque's streetcars or trolleys, and we know how fond we all are of trolleys. I mean, I certainly am. Mapping Dubuque's historic streetcar network. So, an intriguing image right here that shows you dirt-covered roads that have the tracks for the trolleys going right through them. And what does this suggest? Now again, once people will always deride you for even considering other possibilities, and that's all right, because what's wrong with considering other possibilities? You'll find some very intriguing images. Horse-drawn streetcars, 1868 to 1891. And again, we consider that old account with moving around these giant trolley cars with horses. Why not just use open wagons with regular wheels? It's easier on the horses, you'd save a lot of time and effort. Well, unless of course you have a bunch of trolleys that are just sitting there, you don't know how they're powered, you do have animals, and so then you employ the horses that way. So you can use the trolley cars without actually having to build them. I don't know what makes the most amount of sense. I'm not telling you what to think here, and I'm certainly open to other opinions and other perceptions. It could be possible that someone wanted to do the most difficult thing that they could possibly do. But keep in mind that while they were doing this, they were also building these incredible retaining walls in the city of Dubuque. And then you also have the account of how other people came in and decided to employ technology to connect this city. This city, which, oddly enough, did not rise to the level of St. Louis or Des Moines, even though one would think that's what should have happened. And you can see in some of the images how the trolley seems to be very out of place here on these dirt-covered roads. Isn't this an interesting structure back here? Very well built out and almost looks like it's some sort of palace that's overlooking the entire city on the mounds, or the bluffs, or whatever you want to call it. And oddly enough, this is a very conflicting image because we see a mix of technology and what appears to be technological capability, and yet a people who appear to be only capable of moving around with horsepower. Although perhaps this is after somebody had figured out how to get power operational again. Unless we're to believe that Tesla just happened to drop by Dubuque in his spare time, and maybe there's an account of that. But when you look at how the trolley developed and the other methods of transportation, the elevators or funiculars, isn't this intriguing? This good old elevated trolley system. And think about the fact that trains have great difficulty going over any sort of slope, so you have an entirely different technology here that was considered. And then here's that image, the 11th Street elevator, where we see the retaining wall, but we don't see the archway constructed yet. But it's very peculiar, and there's many issues with this image. There's also the fact that this terrain looks very arid for Dubuque, Iowa. Now, yes, you could say the image was taken during the winter, but why does the terrain look just so burned out and arid? Almost as though it had just come through a very difficult period with the climate, as we like to say. But who knows what's really going on here? And who knows on the veracity of this image? Yes, I always question every image. And when you join the live stream exploration tonight, we're actually going to do a little bit of a fun exercise in examining these images. But once again, Dubuque has everything, and here we see these grown out trees, and yet this is the same time frame and a trolley coming down the road. How's that trolley moving? There must be tracks there, although we really can't see it in the image. And so it's another questionable image. But it shows you this development of Dubuque, and it's why Dubuque is so intriguing to me, because it really does seem to be evidence of a civilization that's recovering after some calamitous event, or total catastrophe, or as we like to call it, a reset which destroyed a previous civilization, and a new civilization has to start completely without any knowledge of the previous civilization. That tends to be how I define a reset, but I'm reluctant to define things with hard lines because I prefer to keep an open mind. But again, you'll find no shortage of images that show all these trolleys being used in the city of Dubuque and this development of this transportation grid. Again, all in the 1800s, and again, while they built this incredible retaining wall. Now you think about that retaining wall and all the effort that went into this at the same time. How difficult would it have been for people to manually cut those limestones and then haul them up that very inclined bluff? The same bluff that they had to build one of those elevators or funiculars to get to the top of, because it was so difficult for people even to take the terraced roads. But what's your opinion on it? Please let me know. And there's many other details in Dubuque that we can spend a lot of time unpacking. I like this image too, because this is supposed to show the arrival of the automobile, although we have to wonder, is the automobile other recovered technology? I mean, look at this here. You have this entire brick road that seems to have been recently cleaned off. Now we can say it's dirt. How long have those tracks been there? What's the real nature of this? And you have many of these questionable images in Dubuque. You might recall this brewery, the original Dubuque Star Brewery, and this building is currently being torn down, unfortunately. And I've got some footage of that, which I'll share with the Prime Explorers, and some on-the-ground footage that's going to be in the Prime Explorer video, really looking at what Dubuque looks like today on the ground. But yes, another one of these breweries that's shaped like a castle, because that's exactly what you need. Multiple floors, because it's easy to brew beer when you have multiple floors. And it's apparently easy to construct very complex buildings with many floors, again in the 1800s. Because even though we hadn't invented heavy machinery officially yet, we didn't have electricity until the late 1800s, although many images seem to suggest otherwise. It gives you a very conflicted account about what expectations would be. Now, does that mean the images necessarily prove anything? No. But do they suggest and give many clues? Absolutely. And you'll find other strange images of utter destruction in the city of Dubuque. And it's hard to actually pinpoint the date of this photo, But what's exactly going on here? Was this another one of the fires? Was this a flood in a fire? I mean, yes, we know the area floods a lot. They've built a flood retaining wall. Yes, Dubuque is a city of retaining walls, water retaining walls, terrain retaining walls, and yet somehow it's still held together very well. And if you'll go there, you might notice that the city is very intriguingly laid out, in some sections of it being well maintained and other sections just appearing to be allowed to decay. And yet all these structures are still standing to this day. And I strongly recommend, if you have the capacity or you're nearby, to get on the ground or look at any river town that you can. And then finally, an image from the collapse of this retaining wall. And this just gives you an idea how large these limestones are. Look at this, covering this entire road at Loras College. Now, we could also do an exploration on Loras College. It's interesting in and of itself, but you can see the retaining wall over here. So the Great Walls of Iowa. Once again, more mystery in Iowa, the state that the official historical account tells us was built very quickly from the mid-1800s until 1900. Rapidly populated, courthouses, state capitals, retaining walls, trolleys, technology, all implemented within a very short 50-year period. Don't even bother considering the population because that's not going to make any sense. But what are your thoughts on Dubuque and these retaining walls? What are your theories? Or do you believe that there's a possibility that the mainstream could be correct? My official assessment is I believe the chances of the mainstream being correct continue to diminish with each exploration. But that's just my assessment. What's yours? Thank you for joining me, and it's great to be back.